On the happiest day of my life, sitting in a lavish Chicago ballroom in my custom wedding gown, my phone buzzed with a message from my arrogant new boss. "You are fired effective immediately. Consider it my wedding gift to you." I stared at the screen as he bragged about stealing my biggest corporate merger. But when I showed the text to my quiet new husband, he did not panic. He just took a sip of his bourbon, smiled a dangerously cold smile, and said, "My boss just made a massive mistake." 5 hours later, my phone had 92 missed calls from a collapsing financial empire. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to watch a toxic boss destroy their own life through pure arrogance. My name is Clara, and at 34 years old, I was the lead director of mergers and acquisitions at Thorn Financial. I had spent the last 5 years of my life bleeding for that firm. I worked 80-hour weeks, missed holidays, and navigated brutal corporate negotiations to keep the company afloat, while the CEO, Richard Thorn, took all the credit. I accepted the grueling lifestyle because I was building toward the crowning achievement of my career. It was the acquisition of Thorn Financial by a massive private equity titan named Vanguard Holdings. It was a complex deal I built entirely from the ground up, a delicate house of cards that required my constant and meticulous supervision. That is exactly why my corporate phone was sitting face down on my sweetheart table during my own wedding reception. The ballroom at the Drake Hotel was absolutely breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over 200 of our closest friends, family members, and high-net-worth colleagues. The heavy scent of white roses filled the air, and a live jazz band was playing a soft, romantic melody in the corner of the room. I was sitting right next to my new husband, Ryan. At 36, Ryan was the quietest man in most rooms. He was fiercely supportive, highly observant, unassuming, and brilliant in a way he rarely chose to show off to the world. We had just finished listening to the best man give his speech, and the cheerful clinking of champagne glasses echoed through the massive room. I was finally letting my guard down, finally allowing myself to enjoy the rare luxury of just being a bride. Then the phone vibrated against the polished mahogany table. It was a harsh, persistent buzz that cut right through the joyful noise around me. I tried to ignore it. I really did. I looked at Ryan, who smiled at me and gently squeezed my hand under the table. But the phone vibrated again, and then a third time. In the high-stakes world of corporate finance, a triple text on a Saturday evening meant an absolute disaster was unfolding. I picked up the heavy device, fully expecting to see an urgent message from the Vanguard legal team regarding the closing documents scheduled for Monday morning. Instead, the name flashing on the screen made my stomach tighten into a hard knot. Bradley Thorn. Bradley was 32 years old, the spoiled, incredibly entitled son of the CEO. Just 2 weeks prior, Richard had handed Bradley the title of Executive Vice President, a powerful position Bradley had neither earned through hard work nor possessed the intelligence to understand. Bradley was a man who fundamentally believed he was untouchable. He spent his days taking credit for the tireless work of his subordinates and making impulsive, reckless business decisions just to prove he was the absolute alpha in the room. He deeply resented me because my consistent success and competence highlighted his blatant incompetence to the rest of the board. I opened the message, bracing myself for some minor crisis he had carelessly caused and expected me to fix for my wedding reception. The text was only 3 sentences long, but it shifted the entire atmosphere of the room for me. "Clara, you are terminated effective immediately. Security is currently boxing up your desk and revoking your building access. I am personally taking over the Vanguard Holdings merger from here, so consider your sudden free time my wedding gift to you." I sat perfectly still, the warm white noise of the reception fading into a dull, distant hum. I read the cruel words a second time, to ensure my tired eyes were not playing tricks on me. He was actually firing me. After 5 years of saving his father's struggling company, after engineering the exact deal that would make their family hundreds of millions of dollars, Bradley was firing me on my wedding day. He was doing it just so he could eagerly slap his own name on the final Vanguard merger documents on Monday morning and claim all the financial glory for himself. A normal person might have panicked. A normal bride might have burst into hysterical tears realizing her seven-figure income and years of exhausting dedicated labor had just been stolen by a trust fund baby in a cheap suit. But I did not cry. I did not even gasp. I slowly turned my head and looked at Ryan. He was already watching me, his dark eyes perceptive and incredibly calm. He noticed the slight shift in my posture, the way my fingers tightened around the phone case. He leaned in close, his shoulder brushing against the delicate lace of my gown. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice a low, steady rumble over the sound of the jazz band playing across the room. I did not say a single word to him. I simply unlocked the screen and slid the corporate phone across the white tablecloth, stopping it right next to his glass of bourbon. Ryan looked down at the bright screen. I watched his eyes carefully scan the text message. I waited for the shock. The concern, the inevitable worried questions about what we were going to do now that I was suddenly and unfairly unemployed. Instead, Ryan let out a soft, highly amused breath. He picked up his crystal glass, the ice clinking gently against the sides. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his bourbon. When he looked back at me, his eyes were bright with a dangerous, calculating amusement. A cold smile spread across his handsome face, the exact kind of smile a predator makes when the prey willingly and foolishly walks into an inescapable trap. "Well," Ryan said quietly, his voice laced with pure satisfaction, "he just saved us $3 million in severance payouts." I did not have time to process my husband's stunningly calm reaction, because a sudden clumsy movement caught my attention. Approaching our sweetheart table were Colin and Trent, two junior analysts from my division at Thorne Financial. I had invited them to the wedding as a professional courtesy. They were 20-something finance professionals who usually spent their weekends trying to emulate Bradley's toxic lifestyle. Tonight they were wearing expensive tuxedos, but they looked incredibly out of place as they nervously navigated the sea of white roses and tall crystal centerpieces surrounding our elevated table. Colin was sweating visibly. He kept shifting his weight from one foot to the other, looking anywhere but directly into my eyes. Trent was trying much harder to look intimidating. He puffed out his chest, attempting to channel the unearned arrogance of the man who had just sent me that text message. They stopped right in front of us, blocking the view of the jazz band. Clara Collins started, his voice cracking slightly. "We need to talk to you for a second. It is urgent company business." I placed my champagne flute down on the pristine white tablecloth. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my voice perfectly even. "You are addressing a bride at her own wedding reception, Colin. I strongly suggest you choose your next words with extreme caution." Trent stepped forward, cutting Colin off. He tried to lower his voice to a harsh whisper, but the acoustics of the ballroom carried his words clearly. "Bradley sent us a message. He said you have been officially terminated. We are under direct orders to retrieve all Thorne Financial corporate property from your possession immediately." I looked at Trent as if he were a toddler explaining a finger painting. "I am wearing a custom silk bridal gown, Trent. Do you see pockets on this dress? Where exactly do you think I am hiding a corporate laptop right now?" "We need the company phone," Colin said, pointing a shaking finger at the device sitting next to Ryan's bourbon glass. "And your corporate access badges. Bradley said we cannot leave the venue until we secure the hardware. He is very serious about this, Clara. He said it is a massive security risk to leave you with access to the Vanguard merger files for even one more hour." The sheer audacity of the demand was almost impressive. Bradley was too much of a coward to fire me to my face, so he had dispatched two junior analysts to do his dirty work in the middle of a crowded ballroom. He wanted to humiliate me. He wanted to strip me of my power in front of my friends, my family, and the high-net-worth clients sitting just a few tables away. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table. "You two report to me," I reminded them, my tone freezing the air between us. "You do not report to Bradley. I hired both of you. I trained both of you. I am the reason you received your end-of-year bonuses. And now you are standing at my wedding, eating the $300 plated dinner I paid for, trying to act like corporate enforcers." Trent crossed his arms, trying to physically dominate the space. "Bradley is the executive vice president now. He outranks you. Or rather, he outranked you. You are a former employee as of 10 minutes ago. We are just following protocol for immediate asset retrieval. Hand over the phone, Clara. We do not want to make this a whole thing. You are already making it a whole thing, Ryan said quietly. It was the first time my husband had spoken to them. He had been casually cutting a piece of his steak, completely unbothered by their presence. Now he rested his silver knife on his plate and looked up. Ryan did not raise his voice. He did not posture. But the sheer weight of his gaze made both Colin and Trent take an involuntary step backward. This is Thorne financial business. Trent snapped at Ryan, trying to regain his footing. It does not concern you. The jazz band behind them finished their song. The lead singer thanked the crowd, and a soft, expectant silence fell over the room as the musicians paused to tune their instruments. In that brief window of quiet, the tension radiating from our sweetheart table became the focal point of the entire ballroom. The guests sitting closest to us stopped talking. I saw a few of my top-tier colleagues from the firm exchange alarmed glances. My new in-laws sitting at the immediate family table slowly set their wine glasses down and narrowed their eyes at the two men standing over us. People are staring, Colin whispered to Trent, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. Just grab the phone and let us get out of here. Trent ignored him. The sudden audience seemed to embolden his fragile ego. He leaned directly over the floral arrangement, knocking a white rose onto the tablecloth. He looked down at me with a sneer that perfectly mimicked Bradley's toxic entitlement. Listen to me very closely, Clara, Trent said, his voice carrying over the quiet chatter of the surrounding guests. Bradley gave us strict instructions. You are holding highly sensitive corporate data. If you do not hand over that device and your security badges right this second, we are authorized to call hotel security. We will tell them you are a disgruntled former employee illegally possessing company assets. We will have you physically escorted out of this hotel. I stared at him, letting his threat hang in the air. He was genuinely threatening to have me dragged out of my own wedding reception by hotel security guards. He was trying to publicly destroy the happiest day of my life on the orders of a man who was sitting safely miles away. Are you quite finished? I asked him, my voice carrying zero trace of the panic he so desperately wanted to see. Hand over the phone, Trent demanded one last time, extending his open palm across my wedding table. Or we make a scene that you will never forget. The threat hung in the air, heavy and entirely ridiculous. Trent stood there with his hand extended across my sweetheart table, his face flushed with unearned confidence. He genuinely expected me to crumble. He expected the tears, the desperation, the frantic panic of a woman whose career and reputation had just been erased by a single text message. He fundamentally misunderstood the woman he was dealing with. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I did not give him the satisfaction of seeing even a flicker of fear in my eyes. I placed both of my hands flat on the smooth white tablecloth and slowly stood up. The heavy silk of my custom bridal gown rustled against the chair, the sound cutting through the tense silence that had settled over our corner of the ballroom. As I rose to my full height, I saw Colin physically shrink back. He knew exactly what happened when I stood up in corporate boardrooms. He had witnessed me dismantle veteran negotiators and tear apart hostile acquisition terms without ever raising my voice. He was about to learn what happened when I stood up at my own wedding. I looked Trent dead in the eye, radiating absolute icy calm. I spoke with a quiet, lethal precision that made the blood drain from his face. I asked him if he knew where he was standing. I reminded him that he was currently inside a private ballroom at the Drake Hotel, an event space that my husband and I had rented for the evening. The security guards he was so eagerly threatening to call worked for the venue, and as the clients paying a small fortune for this reception, we dictated exactly who was allowed to remain on the premises. I leaned forward slightly, closing the distance between us, and told him that he was not executing corporate protocol. He was trespassing. Trent opened his mouth to argue, but the words died in his throat. His false bravado shattered against the absolute certainty in my voice. He glanced nervously at Ryan. My husband had not moved to defend me, not because he was intimidated, but because he knew I did not need defending. Ryan was still casually swirling the bourbon in his crystal glass, watching the exchange with that same dangerous, predatory smile. His quiet presence was a wall of authority that Trent could not breach. The surrounding tables were completely silent now. The high net worth clients, the hedge fund managers, and the industry titans I had invited to this wedding were watching the spectacle unfold. They were watching two junior analysts attempt to intimidate the lead director, who had single-handedly kept Thorn Financial from collapsing over the past 5 years. They saw the desperation in Trent and Colin, and they saw the absolute control I maintained over the situation. I reached down and picked up the sleek, black corporate smartphone from the table. It felt heavy in my palm. It was the device that had tethered me to Bradley Thorn and his father for years, the device that rang at 2 in the morning when they needed me to fix their catastrophic financial mistakes. Bradley wanted his hardware back. He wanted to strip me of my access so he could proudly steal my merger and claim the victory for himself. I held the phone up right between Trent and Colin, their eyes locked onto the dark screen anticipating my surrender. Next to my dinner plate sat a tall crystal flute filled to the brim with vintage champagne. It had been poured for the best man's toast just minutes prior. Without breaking eye contact with Trent, I moved the corporate phone directly over the glass. I let my fingers open. The heavy device plunged into the crystal flute. Golden bubbles violently erupted over the rim, spilling onto the pristine white tablecloth. A sharp, satisfying splash echoed in the quiet space. The expensive electronics fizzed audibly as the liquid breached the casing. The phone screen flashed bright white beneath the golden champagne for 1 single second and then went permanently entirely dark. Colin gasped loudly, taking a massive step backward as if the glass had exploded. Trent just stared at the submerged phone, his mouth hanging open, completely paralyzed by the sheer disrespect of the action. He had come here to strip me of my power, and I had just destroyed his authority with a single gesture. I calmly wrapped my fingers around the stem of the wet crystal flute. I slid the glass across the smooth table, pushing it right to the edge, stopping it mere inches from Trent's frozen hand. The dead phone sat heavily at the bottom of the bubbling champagne. I leaned in just close enough for the two junior analysts to hear the quiet, absolute promise in my voice. I told them to take the glass. I told them to deliver it directly to their new boss. Tell Bradley he can keep the hardware. He is going to need it to call his bankruptcy lawyer on Monday. Trent stared at the submerged phone, the golden bubbles rising around the cracked screen, and the sheer disrespect of my action finally broke through his initial shock. His face flushed a dark, angry red. He slammed his hand down on the edge of my sweetheart table, rattling the fine silver cutlery. "You just intentionally destroyed company property," Trent snarled, his voice pitching up a full octave. "That is a direct violation of your non-disclosure agreement and a material breach of your employment contract. Thorn Financial is going to sue you for every single asset you possess, Clara. We are calling hotel security right now to detain you, and then we are calling the corporate legal department to file formal charges for destruction of proprietary data." Colin nodded frantically behind him, pulling out his own smartphone as if to dial the authorities right then and there. "You crossed a massive line, Clara. You are going to be held legally and financially liable for this. Bradley is not going to let this slide. I did not even have to open my mouth to destroy their amateur legal threats." Before I could utter a single syllable, the sharp, rhythmic click of stiletto heels echoed against the polished hardwood of the dance floor. A voice cut through the tense atmosphere, crisp, authoritative, and radiating absolute, unapologetic boredom. "I highly recommend you put that phone away, Colin, unless you are calling your own personal defense attorney." I smiled. Ryan took another relaxed sip of his bourbon. Stepping out from the lineup of the bridal party was my sister-in-law, Naomi. At 34, Naomi was a force of nature. She was an African-American woman with a brilliant, razor-sharp mind, currently serving as a senior partner at Crawford and Pierce Litigation, one of the most ruthless corporate defense firms in Chicago. She looked absolutely flawless in her floor-length emerald green bridesmaid gown. Her hair was styled to perfection, and her makeup was immaculate, but the look in her dark eyes was pure lethal corporate warfare. Naomi glided over to our table holding a glass of sparkling water. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She possessed the kind of natural, commanding presence that made grown men in boardrooms sweat through their expensive suits. "And who exactly are you?" Trent demanded, trying to puff out his chest again, though his voice wavered slightly as Naomi stopped right in front of him. "I am the bride's sister-in-law," Naomi said smoothly, taking a slow sip of her water. "I am also a senior partner at Crawford and Pierce Litigation, and right now I am the only thing standing between you two and a massive career-ending civil lawsuit." Trent scoffed, trying to maintain his tough guy facade. "We are executing corporate protocol on behalf of Thorne Financial. Clara breached her contract. She destroyed company hardware." Naomi tilted her head, looking at Trent as if he were a particularly slow child who had just failed a basic math test. "Let us dissect that incredibly stupid statement, shall we? You are claiming a breach of contract based on a water-damaged piece of hardware. Please cite the exact clause in Clara's employment contract that categorizes accidental or even intentional hardware damage as a material breach of her non-disclosure agreement." Trent opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Colin frantically looked back and forth between his partner and my sister-in-law. "You cannot cite it." Naomi continued, her tone clinical and merciless. "Because under Illinois labor codes specifically regarding corporate property, the destruction of a standard-issue mobile device does not constitute a breach of an NDA unless proprietary data was leaked or transferred to an unauthorized third party. Dropping a phone into a glass of vintage champagne is a hardware replacement issue. It usually incurs a standard $300 deduction from a final paycheck. It is not a federal crime, Trent. You sound ridiculous." "She still has company property." Trent argued, his confidence rapidly draining away under Naomi's intellectual assault. "We have direct orders from Bradley Thorne to seize her laptop and her access badges immediately." Naomi smiled. It was not a friendly expression. "Direct orders from an executive vice president. How fascinating. Tell me, Trent, did Bradley Thorne also provide you with a court-issued writ of replevin?" Colin blinked, his panic deepening. "A what?" "A writ of replevin." Naomi repeated, slowly enunciating every syllable so the guests at the surrounding tables could hear perfectly. "It is a legal order granted by a judge that allows a party to seize physical assets from a private citizen. Because right now you are standing in a privately rented event space, demanding that a private citizen hand over physical items without legal authorization." "It is Thorne Financial property?" Trent insisted, his voice growing desperate as he realized he was losing control of the narrative. "It is property currently in the lawful possession of my client." Naomi fired back seamlessly, stepping into her role as my legal counsel. "Until a formal termination package is signed and processed by Human Resources. Clara retains lawful possession of those items pending a standard return protocol. You cannot simply walk up to a woman at her wedding reception and demand she empty her purse on the command of a man who just got his promotion 2 weeks ago." Naomi took a step closer to the two men. The sheer force of her intellect was suffocating them. "So let us clarify exactly what is happening here," Naomi said, raising her voice just enough so the high-net-worth guests, the hedge fund managers, and the industry titans sitting nearby could hear every single word. "You are admitting loudly and in front of 200 witnesses that you are attempting an illegal, unauthorized seizure of property from a private venue. You have no court order. You have no formal documentation from Human Resources. You are operating solely on an unverified text message sent by an executive vice president who apparently does not understand basic corporate law." Colin looked absolutely terrified. He took another step back, bumping into a gold Chiavari chair. "We just wanted the badges." Trent muttered, his tough guy persona completely shattered. He was looking at the polished hardwood floor now, unable to meet Naomi's piercing gaze. "I am going to ask you a very simple question, Trent," Naomi said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "And I highly suggest you answer it honestly, because I have several colleagues in this room taking mental notes for the impending harassment lawsuit. Does Bradley Thorne actually have the legal authority to order the physical seizure of property off company grounds without a court order?" Trent swallowed hard. The silence in the ballroom was deafening. The jazz band had entirely stopped playing. The waiters holding silver trays had stopped serving. Everyone was waiting for the answer. Does he? Naomi pressed her tone, demanding absolute compliance. Trent looked at Colin, who was currently shaking his head silently, begging his partner to concede before they both got sued into oblivion and blacklisted from the Chicago finance sector forever. No. Trent finally whispered, his voice defeated, small and thoroughly humiliated. No, he does not have the legal authority. Naomi did not let up. She leaned closer, her dark eyes pinning Trent to the floor. Exactly. He has no authority. Yet here you are, risking your own professional licenses to do the dirty work of a man who cannot even be bothered to fire my sister-in-law to her face. Colin swallowed hard, looking desperately at the exit. Trent remained frozen, his hands empty, the champagne-soaked phone sitting mockingly on the table between us. Let us talk about your new executive vice president, Naomi said, her voice projecting clearly across the ballroom. Let us talk about Bradley Thorne. You two idolize him. You follow him around the office hoping some of his unearned wealth rubs off on you. But you are forgetting who actually signs the checks that pay your salaries. It is not Bradley. It is the revenue generated by the woman sitting right in front of you. Trent opened his mouth to defend his boss, but Naomi cut him down instantly. Do not even try to defend him, Trent. I know the internal numbers of Thorne Financial better than you do. I know that Clara worked 80-hour weeks for 3 solid years to keep your entire division from drowning in insolvency. I know she slept on the leather sofa in her office during the third quarter restructuring while Bradley was busy posting photos from a yacht in the Hamptons. The guests at the nearby tables were leaning in, completely captivated by the brutal takedown. I saw a senior partner from a rival firm nodding slowly in agreement. Everyone in the Chicago finance sector knew Bradley was a liability, but no one had ever dared to say it out loud at a high society event. You want to talk about corporate loyalty? Naomi continued, her tone dripping with absolute disdain. Where was Bradley's loyalty to the firm when Clara had to spend 48 straight hours doing damage control because he got his second driving under the influence charge in Montauk? Where was his corporate protocol when she had to leverage her own professional reputation to stop 3 major clients from pulling their portfolios after Bradley insulted them at a charity gala? He did not care about the firm then. He only cares now because Clara finally built something he desperately wants to steal. Colin took another step back, bumping into a waiter holding a tray of hors d'oeuvres. The waiter smoothly sidestepped him, offering the tray to a guest, completely ignoring the humiliated junior analyst. She built the Vanguard Holdings merger from absolutely nothing, Naomi said, gesturing gracefully toward me. She scouted the acquisition. She ran the risk assessments. She negotiated the preliminary terms while Bradley was nursing hangovers in his corner office. She handed him the greatest financial victory in the history of Thorne Financial on a silver platter. And you really think that Trust Fund Baby can close the Vanguard deal on Monday morning without her? The silence in the ballroom was absolute. The sheer truth of Naomi's words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Even Trent, blinded by his desperate need for Bradley's approval, could not argue with the facts. He knew Bradley was incompetent. He knew the Vanguard deal was a delicate multi-billion-dollar house of cards that required my specific expertise to keep it from collapsing. You are a pawn, Trent, Naomi stated, delivering the final crushing blow. Bradley sent you here to embarrass Clara, but he actually set you up to take the fall. When the Vanguard executives realize they are dealing with a man who does not even understand the basic valuation metrics of his own company, the deal will crash. And when Richard Thorne asks his son why the firm just lost a multi-billion-dollar acquisition, Bradley will blame you. He will say you botched the termination protocol and caused a massive legal liability. He will fire you before lunchtime on Tuesday to save his own skin. Trent's shoulders slumped. The arrogant posture he had marched up to our table with was entirely gone. He finally understood the reality of the situation. He had marched into a minefield, blindly following a man who would gladly let him explode. Colin did not wait for his partner. He turned on his heel and practically sprinted toward the ballroom exit, his head down, desperate to escape the judging eyes of the Chicago financial elite. Trent stood there for one more second, staring at the ruined corporate phone submerged in my champagne glass. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a sudden very real terror regarding his future. I did not offer him a single drop of pity. I simply raised an eyebrow and waited for him to leave my reception. Trent turned and power walked out of the ballroom, nearly tripping over the edge of the carpet in his haste to follow Colin out the doors. The moment they disappeared into the hotel lobby, the tension in the room instantly evaporated. A low murmur of conversation started up again as guests turned back to their tables, eagerly discussing the spectacular public execution they had just witnessed. The jazz band smoothly transitioned into an upbeat, lively tune, seamlessly covering the awkwardness of the interruption. Ryan picked up his glass of bourbon again and took a slow sip. He looked up at his sister with genuine admiration. "You know, Naomi," he said casually, "I think that was your best closing argument yet." Naomi smoothed down the front of her emerald bridesmaid dress, looking completely unfazed by the confrontation. "Corporate bullies are all the same," she said, taking a sip of her sparkling water. "They rely on intimidation because they lack the intellect to actually engage in a fair fight. You just have to remind them that they are out of their depth." I reached out and squeezed Naomi's hand. "Thank you," I told her. "I owe you a massive retainer fee for that one." "Consider it my wedding gift to you," she replied with a sharp, brilliant smile. "I have been wanting to put those two in their place since they showed up at the cocktail hour acting like they owned the venue." I smiled back, feeling a profound sense of gratitude for my new family. They did not coddle me, and they did not try to manage my crises for me. They simply stood beside me like an impenetrable wall of support, ready to go to war the second anyone tried to cross a line. I took a deep breath, finally feeling the adrenaline of the confrontation begin to recede. I reached for my water glass, ready to return my focus to the beautiful reception we had planned. I wanted to dance with my husband. I wanted to celebrate the fact that I was officially free from the toxic grip of Thorn Financial. But the universe was not finished with me yet. Deep inside the small, beaded clutch resting on the chair next to me, a sudden frantic vibration began. It was not the steady rhythmic buzz of an incoming phone call. It was a rapid, chaotic series of short bursts. It was my personal backup phone, the one I only gave to my most trusted senior colleagues at the firm. I unclasped the small evening bag and pulled the device out. The screen was completely flooded with notifications. They were pouring in so fast I could barely read the text previews. Dozens of messages from the lead analysts, the risk assessment team, and the senior compliance officers I had mentored for years. I unlocked the screen and opened the first message from my lead compliance director. The words made the blood freeze in my veins all over again. The screenshot was sent by David, my lead compliance director, and one of the most level-headed men in the Chicago financial district. Above the attached image, David had typed a single frantic sentence. "Tell me your phone was hacked and you did not actually approve this garbage." I tapped the image to expand it. It was a company-wide email blasted out to all 2,000 employees at Thorn Financial, CCing the board of directors and our top-tier external partners. The sender was Bradley Thorn. The subject line read, "Organizational updates and congratulating Clara." I read the text and a cold, pure fury radiated outward from my chest. It was a masterclass in corporate gaslighting. Bradley had written the email with a sickeningly sweet, patronizing tone that completely erased my 5 years of grueling, firm-saving labor. "It is with a mixture of immense gratitude and a heavy heart that we announce Clara's immediate departure from Thorn Financial," the email began. "As many of you know, Clara is celebrating her wedding today. After extensive discussions regarding the intense around-the-clock demands of the upcoming Vanguard Holdings merger, Clara has decided to graciously step down from her role as lead director. She has chosen to prioritize her new marriage and focus on her domestic responsibilities during this beautiful new chapter of her life. We thank her for her past contributions, and I will be personally stepping in to assume full command of the Vanguard acquisition to ensure our teams cross the finish line without interruption." I stared at the glowing screen. I did not step down. I did not resign. I was fired via text message by a man who had spent the last 3 years nursing hangovers while I negotiated billion-dollar deals to keep his father's company out of bankruptcy. And now, to save his own skin and cover up his unauthorized termination of a lead director, Bradley was weaponizing my wedding day against me. He was painting me as a fragile, overwhelmed woman who simply could not handle the pressure of the corporate big leagues. He was telling the entire financial sector that I had abandoned my team at the 11th hour to go play housewife. I handed the phone to Naomi. Read this, I told her, my voice eerily calm. Naomi took the phone, her dark eyes quickly scanning the screen. As she processed Bradley's words, her flawless posture stiffened. The composed, elegant bridesmaid vanished, and the lethal corporate litigator took her place entirely. She let out a sharp, incredulous laugh that carried no humor whatsoever. Domestic responsibilities. Naomi read aloud, tasting the words as if they were poison. He actually put the words domestic responsibilities in a company-wide corporate broadcast. He just handed us a textbook case for gender discrimination, defamation, and constructive discharge, all neatly packaged with a digital paper trail. This man is not just arrogant. He is a walking, talking legal liability. Ryan stepped closer, wrapping a warm, steady arm around my waist. He leaned over his sister's shoulder to read the email. A low, dark chuckle vibrated in his chest. Bradley is trying to control the narrative before Monday morning. Ryan observed, his voice completely devoid of panic. He knows that when the board finds out you are gone, they will panic. So he is framing it as a mutual personal life choice. He thinks if he plays the supportive boss who let the tired bride go home, the board will not question the sudden transition of power. My phone vibrated again in Naomi's hand, and again. The notifications were a relentless stream of panic from my division. David texted again, demanding to know if he should draft a retraction. Amanda, my senior risk analyst, sent a barrage of messages saying the underwriting team was completely freaking out about Monday's final Vanguard meeting. They knew Bradley lacked the fundamental financial literacy to answer Vanguard's intense due diligence questions. They knew that without me in the room to navigate the hostile waters of private equity, Thorn Financial was going to get slaughtered. I reached out and took my phone back from Naomi. I quickly typed a message to David and copied my top analysts. Do not panic. Do exactly as Bradley says. Do not challenge him. Let him drive the car. I hit send and locked the screen. I was not going to save Bradley from his own ego. If he wanted to drive the car, I was going to let him steer it right off a cliff. You have to admire the sheer, unadulterated delusion, Naomi said, shaking her head as she picked up her own designer clutch from the table. He fires the architect of the biggest deal in the firm's history, insults her in front of 2,000 people, and genuinely believes he is going to walk into a boardroom on Monday and successfully close a multi-billion-dollar acquisition with a private equity titan. Naomi unclasped her bag and pulled out her sleek, ultra-thin tablet. As a senior partner at Crawford & Pierce, she paid a premium for access to elite real-time financial alerts. Her device was synced directly to proprietary market terminals and private regulatory filing databases, allowing her to monitor major corporate shifts the second they occurred. She tapped the screen to wake it up, intending to check if Bradley had filed any preliminary notices with the board regarding the executive shift. Instead, the screen lit up with a high-priority red banner notification. Naomi stopped moving. She stared at the tablet, her eyes widening slightly. In the years I had known her, I had never seen Naomi genuinely surprised by anything in the corporate world. But right now, she was looking at her screen as if she had just witnessed a bank robbery in broad daylight. A slow, brilliant, absolutely predatory smile began to spread across her face. It was a smile that promised absolute devastation. Clara, Naomi said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial, electrified whisper. You are not going to believe what this trust fund idiot just did. What is it? I asked, stepping closer to look at the screen. Bradley did not just send that email to cover his tracks. Naomi said, her fingers flying across the glass screen to open the full digital filing. He was terrified that the board of directors might actually call you and beg you to come back before the Vanguard meeting on Monday. He was terrified that his father would overrule the termination once he saw the backlash from your department. So Bradley decided to lock everyone out. He decided to force their hands. Ryan looked at his sister, that cold, knowing amusement returning to his eyes. Tell me he did not do what I think he did. He did exactly what you think he did. Naomi laughed, turning the tablet around so Ryan and I could see the blazing red alert on the screen. It was an automated notification from the digital clearinghouse used for elite corporate acquisitions. Bradley Thorne had just submitted the final legally binding signatures for the Vanguard Holdings merger. He did not wait for Monday morning. He did not wait for the final risk assessment review. Drunk on his own perceived power and desperate to cement his legacy as the man who secured Thorne Financial's future, Bradley had logged into the secure portal using his new executive vice president credentials. He had bypassed the legal team, bypassed the compliance officers, and prematurely executed the acquisition documents. He signed them, Naomi whispered, shaking her head in sheer disbelief at the magnitude of the stupidity. He actually executed a multi-billion-dollar merger contract without his lead director, without his legal counsel present, and without reading the final clauses. He thinks he just won. He thinks he just locked you out and secured a massive payday for himself. I stared at the digital confirmation on the screen. A wave of absolute chilling satisfaction washed over me. Bradley thought he had just outsmarted me. He thought he had stolen my crown jewel. He had absolutely no idea that he had just signed his own death warrant. Ryan let out a soft, dark laugh. He reached out and gently took my hand, his thumb tracing over my new wedding band. "Well," Ryan said quietly, his gaze locked on the tablet screen. "I suppose we should prepare to receive our uninvited guest." Before I could ask him what he meant, a sudden commotion echoed from the heavy mahogany doors at the far end of the ballroom. The doors swung open violently, hitting the wall with a loud thud that caused several guests to jump in their seats. Standing in the entryway, adjusting the cuffs of his overly expensive designer suit, was Bradley Thorne. Bradley did not march in looking angry or defensive. He strutted. He walked down the center aisle of the ballroom, with a wide, arrogant grin plastered across his face, acting as though this was his own private victory party. His face was flushed, likely from a combination of top-shelf scotch and the massive adrenaline rush of prematurely executing a billion-dollar contract. He surveyed the room with absolute entitlement, his eyes scanning the tables of wealthy investors, hedge fund managers, and corporate titans that I had personally invited to my wedding. He paused twice on his way to my table, clapping the shoulders of two senior banking executives attempting to network and insert himself into their conversations. They looked at him with polite confusion, clearly wondering why the new executive vice president of Thorne Financial was crashing his lead director's wedding reception right after sending a bizarre company-wide email about her departure. Bradley finally reached our sweetheart table. He did not look at Naomi, who was watching him with the detached fascination of a biologist observing a doomed insect. He did not look at Ryan, who had leaned back in his chair, quietly resting his hands on the table. Bradley only looked at me. "Clara," he said loudly, making sure his voice carried to the surrounding tables. "I just had to come down here personally. I could not let you celebrate your big day without checking in on you." He placed his hands on his hips, putting on a sickening display of fake sympathy. He actually tilted his head and pouted his lower lip. "I know today has been a lot to process." Bradley continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "The email I sent earlier caused quite a stir at the office. But I wanted everyone to know that there are no hard feelings. It takes a truly brave woman to admit when the corporate pressure is simply too much to handle. Stepping down to focus on being a wife is a beautiful choice, Clara. It really is. We all support you." The sheer audacity of the man was breathtaking. He had fired me via text message. He had ordered junior analysts to seize my property. He had locked me out of the corporate servers. And now he was standing in front of my wedding guests, weaponizing his own gaslighting email and pretending he was a benevolent boss who had graciously allowed me to retire from a stressful job. He was trying to publicly humiliate me while simultaneously painting himself as the hero of Thorne Financial. I did not break eye contact. I did not flinch. I let him bask in the silence. "You must be feeling incredibly relieved," Bradley said, mistaking my silence for defeat. No more 80-hour weeks, no more late-night risk assessment calls. You can finally just relax and let your new husband take care of things. The Vanguard merger was becoming a beast anyway. It is much better off in my hands now. I have already taken the wheel. You do not need to worry about a thing. Ryan shifted slightly in his seat. He looked up at Bradley with an expression of mild curiosity. It is very generous of you to take the wheel, Bradley Ryan said, his tone perfectly flat. Driving can be quite dangerous if you do not know where you are going. Bradley scoffed, dismissing Ryan entirely. He looked at my husband as if Ryan were a minor inconvenience, a simple civilian who could not possibly comprehend the high-stakes world of corporate finance. I know exactly where I am going, Bradley boasted, puffing out his chest. In fact, I just secured the biggest victory this firm has ever seen. The ink is drying right now. That is actually why I am here. A night like tonight deserves a proper celebration. Before I could ask him what exactly he thought he was celebrating, Bradley turned his back on our table. He looked toward the corner of the ballroom where the live jazz band was softly playing a romantic standard. Bradley raised his arm and snapped his fingers loudly at the musicians. "Stop the music," Bradley ordered, gesturing broadly. "Cut the music right now." The bandleader looked confused, but slowly signaled the musicians to stop. The smooth saxophone melody died out, and an awkward, heavy silence fell over the entire ballroom. 200 guests stopped eating. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Every single face in the room turned toward the sweetheart table, watching the man in the designer suit who had just interrupted a wedding reception. Bradley loved the attention. He thrived on it. He walked over to the bandleader and held out his hand, demanding the microphone. The bandleader hesitated, looking over at me for approval. I gave a very small, almost imperceptible nod. Let him have it. Let him dig the hole as deep as he possibly could. The bandleader handed over the microphone. Bradley tapped the top of it twice, the harsh thumping sound echoing through the venue's massive sound system. He walked back toward the center of the dance floor, positioning himself perfectly so that every high-net-worth client, every corporate executive, and every member of my family had a clear view of him. "Excuse me, everyone," Bradley announced, his voice booming through the speakers. "I know I am not on the official schedule tonight, but I felt it was absolutely necessary to say a few words. For those of you who do not know me, I am Bradley Thorne, Executive Vice President of Thorne Financial." He paused, letting his newly acquired title hang in the air, clearly expecting a murmur of impressed recognition. Instead, he was met with dead silence. Naomi took a slow sip of her sparkling water, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. "I have had the distinct privilege of working with our beautiful bride Clara for the past 5 years." Bradley continued, pacing slowly across the dance floor. "We have been through a lot together. But as many of you in the financial sector know, this industry is not for the faint of heart. It requires a certain kind of ruthless dedication. It requires an unwavering focus that, quite frankly, leaves very little room for a personal life." He looked directly at me, his smile wide and victorious. He was preparing to publicly execute my professional reputation. He was about to tell 200 of the most powerful people in Chicago that I was weak, that I had cracked under the pressure of the Vanguard deal, and that he had stepped in to save the day. "So tonight," Bradley said, raising his empty hand, as if holding an invisible glass, "I want to propose a special toast to Clara, a toast to her new, quieter life, and a toast to knowing when it is time to step aside and let the real leaders take charge." Bradley stood in the center of the dance floor, gripping the microphone as if he were holding a trophy. He surveyed the room, soaking in the complete silence of 200 highly influential guests. He thought they were hanging on his every word. He failed to realize they were holding their collective breath, waiting to see if he was actually stupid enough to publicly execute a senior executive at her own wedding. He was. "I just wanted to take a brief moment to celebrate Clara," Bradley announced, his voice echoing through the massive speakers. "As Executive Vice President of Thorne Financial, I have had a front-row seat to her dedication. She has worked incredibly hard on the Vanguard Holdings acquisition. Some might say too hard." He offered a fake sympathetic sigh. "The financial sector is a beast." Bradley continued pacing slowly like a motivational speaker. It demands everything from you. It demands late nights, canceled vacations, and a level of intense, unrelenting focus that can easily break a person. Over the past few weeks, as we approached the finish line of the Vanguard deal, I could see the toll it was taking on Clara. The pressure was simply becoming too much for her to bear. Naomi let out a sharp, incredulous scoff from our table. Ryan placed a calming hand on her arm, his dark eyes locked onto Bradley with the lethal patience of a sniper. So as a leader, Bradley declared, puffing out his chest. I had to make a difficult executive decision. I had to prioritize the well-being of my team over the corporate grind. I sat down and looked at the situation, and I realized that Clara needed to be released from this burden. She needed to step away from the massive pressure of high finance and focus on what truly matters in life. Her new husband, her domestic responsibilities, being a wife. A collective audible gasp rippled through the ballroom. A senior partner from Crawford and Pierce litigation sitting 3 tables away actually dropped her fork onto her china plate. Did he really just say that on a hot microphone? Therefore, Bradley concluded, raising his voice to ensure maximum impact. I have officially relieved Clara of her duties at Thorne Financial. I have personally taken over the completion of the Vanguard merger to ensure our firm's absolute victory. Clara, you are free. Enjoy your retirement. He smiled brightly, anticipating a round of applause for his benevolent leadership. The silence that followed was so profound it was almost deafening. No one clapped, no one cheered. The 200 guests simply stared at him in absolute horrified disbelief. He had just admitted to a massive corporate restructuring, insulted the bride's professional competence, and delivered a textbook case of gender discrimination on a microphone. I did not let the silence stretch for more than 3 seconds. I stood up. I pushed my chair back, the heavy silk of my wedding gown rustling loudly. I walked out from behind the sweetheart table and stepped down onto the polished dance floor. Bradley saw me coming, and his smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He expected me to scream at him. He expected me to throw a drink in his face or dissolve into hysterical tears. He braced himself for a messy emotional confrontation that would validate his narrative of a fragile woman cracking under pressure. I did not give him a messy confrontation. I gave him a corporate execution. I walked right up to him, radiating absolute terrifying calm. I did not look angry. I looked serene. I extended my hand, my palm open, demanding the microphone. Bradley hesitated. He gripped the microphone tightly, unsure of how to proceed. "Hand it over, Bradley," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper, carrying only far enough for him to hear. "Unless you want me to start discussing your Cayman Islands expense accounts on the venue's PA system." His eyes widened in panic. He relinquished the microphone immediately. I turned to face the room. 200 pairs of eyes were locked onto me. I took a deep, steadying breath. "First of all, I want to thank Bradley Thorne for coming down here tonight," I began, my voice projecting clearly and smoothly through the speakers. "It takes a remarkable amount of dedication for an executive vice president to personally crash a wedding reception just to deliver an organizational update." A low rumble of nervous laughter rippled through the audience. "I especially want to thank him for his incredible generosity." I continued pacing slowly, mimicking his exact earlier movements. "As Bradley just informed you all, he has officially relieved me of my duties at Thorne Financial. What he did not mention is the sheer magnitude of the favor he just did for me." I stopped pacing and looked directly at Bradley. He looked confused, entirely unsure of where I was going with this. "You see," I explained to the room, "when you hold a position like lead director of mergers and acquisitions, you are bound by an incredibly strict, suffocatingly tight, non-compete clause. That clause dictates that you cannot leave the firm to work for a competitor, or start your own venture, or transition to a private equity firm for a minimum of 2 years following your resignation. It is an ironclad contract designed to keep top talent locked in place." I turned fully toward Bradley, locking eyes with him. However, I continued, my voice ringing out clearly. "That non-compete clause only applies if the employee resigns voluntarily. It only applies if the employee steps down." I paused, letting the silence build the tension. But if an employee is terminated, I stated, my tone dropping to a dangerous, precise level. If an employee is fired outright, that non-compete clause is immediately rendered null and void. The employee is instantly released into the open market, free to take their expertise, their client relationships, and their institutional knowledge to any competing firm in the world. Bradley's face went slack. The confusion vanished, replaced by a sudden dawning terror as he finally realized what I was doing. So, I would like to clarify a very important legal distinction for the record tonight, I said, turning back to the captivated audience. Bradley just stood here and claimed I stepped down to focus on domestic duties. But I did not step down. I did not resign. I did not voluntarily leave my position at Thorn Financial. I turned back to Bradley, lifting the microphone slightly. Did I, Bradley? I asked him directly. Did I submit a letter of resignation? Did I ask you to relieve me of my duties? Bradley swallowed hard. He looked at the sea of faces watching him. He knew he was trapped. If he lied and claimed I resigned, he would be committing fraud in front of 200 elite witnesses. If he admitted the truth, he would be destroying his own narrative. His ego, massive and incredibly fragile, made the decision for him. He could not stand being backed into a corner by a subordinate. He could not stand looking weak in front of the Chicago financial elite. You didn't resign. Bradley snapped, his voice loud enough to carry without the microphone. I fired you. I sent you the termination notice myself, effective immediately. I nodded slowly, letting the admission land heavily in the silent ballroom. You fired me, I repeated into the microphone, ensuring everyone heard it perfectly. You terminated the lead director of mergers and acquisitions. Yes, Bradley sneered, taking a step toward me, his arrogance blinding him to the trap he was willingly walking into. Fascinating, I said, tilting my head slightly. And did you clear this massive executive restructuring with the board of directors? Did you submit a formal termination package through human resources citing a breach of contract or poor performance? I am the executive vice president. Bradley barked, his face flushing red with anger. I don't need to ask permission from HR. I took a step closer to him, pressing the attack. But you need to ask the board, Bradley. A termination at the director level requires a majority vote from the board of directors. Did you hold a vote? Did you inform your father, the CEO, that you were terminating the lead architect of the Vanguard merger? Bradley scoffed, throwing his hands up in sheer exasperation. He was so desperate to prove his ultimate authority that he completely abandoned any sense of corporate preservation. I don't need to consult the board, Bradley shouted, his voice echoing loudly across the dance floor. I don't need to ask my father for permission. I am running this division now. I fired you unilaterally, Clara, because you were a liability to the Vanguard deal. You were holding us back. He pointed a finger at me, his chest heaving with misplaced triumph. I made the executive decision, Bradley declared to the entire room. I fired you without cause, without the board, and without severance, and it was the best decision this firm has made in a decade. I lowered the microphone. I did not speak. I did not need to. Bradley had just proudly confessed on a hot microphone in front of 200 high-net-worth witnesses and corporate litigators to terminating a senior director unilaterally without cause and without board approval. He had just handed me a golden ticket to a wrongful termination lawsuit that would bankrupt a small country. But I did not want a lawsuit. I wanted absolute annihilation. Bradley, breathless from his outburst, glared at me triumphantly. He genuinely believed he had won. He believed he had asserted his dominance and crushed my rebellion in front of my guests. You think you're so smart, Clara, Bradley sneered, leaning in close. But you're just unemployed. I'm the one holding the keys to the kingdom. I don't need the board. I don't need you. I just closed the Vanguard acquisition myself. I own this firm. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Everyone was waiting for my response. They were waiting for me to deliver the final blow. I did not have to. A chair scraped loudly against the polished hardwood floor. Ryan stood up from the sweetheart table. He moved slowly, deliberately, his dark suit impeccable, his presence commanding absolute attention without him uttering a single word. He walked down the small set of stairs and stepped onto the dance floor, moving smoothly until he was standing right beside me. He looked at Bradley. He did not look angry. He looked profoundly, devastatingly bored. "No, Bradley," Ryan said quietly, his voice cutting through the silent ballroom like a scalpel. "You didn't. I am the executive vice president of Thorn Financial." Bradley sneered, his voice amplifying through the microphone and bouncing off the crystal chandeliers above us. "I do not need the board of directors. I do not need human resources. And I certainly do not need you, Clara. I just closed the Vanguard Holdings acquisition myself. I own this firm." He stood with his chest puffed out, breathing heavily through his nose. He glared at me, his eyes wide with a manic, unearned triumph. He genuinely believed that his title was a magic wand that could rewrite reality. He believed that typing his password into a secure digital portal had instantly transformed him from an incompetent nepotism hire into a legendary corporate titan. The silence in the grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel was absolute. 200 of the most powerful people in the Chicago financial sector were staring at a man who was actively immolating his own career on a hot microphone. Then a heavy wooden chair scraped loudly against the polished hardwood floor behind me. I did not have to turn around to know what was happening. Ryan stood up from our sweetheart table. He moved slowly, deliberately smoothing the front of his tailored black tuxedo jacket. He did not look angry. He did not look intimidated. He looked profoundly, devastatingly bored. Ryan walked down the 3 small steps from our elevated table and stepped onto the dance floor. He moved with the quiet, effortless grace of a man who possessed absolute power and felt zero need to broadcast it. The physical contrast between the two men was staggering. Bradley was sweating frantic and practically vibrating with desperate arrogance. Ryan was an immovable wall of calm. Ryan stopped right beside me, placing a warm, steadying hand on the lower curve of my back. He looked Bradley up and down, examining the panicked executive like a piece of defective machinery. "No, Bradley," Ryan said quietly. His voice did not require a microphone. It cut through the silent ballroom like a scalpel carrying a weight that forced everyone in the room to pay attention. "You didn't." Bradley gripped the microphone tighter. The triumphant sneer slid off his face, replaced by a dark, ugly scowl. He stared at my husband, his eyes narrowing with immediate hostility. "Excuse me," Bradley barked, raising the microphone back to his mouth. "Who exactly do you think you are talking to? You are just the groom. Go sit back down at your little table and let the adults handle corporate business." Ryan did not flinch. He did not take the bait. He simply tilted his head, regarding Bradley with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. That look of pity infuriated Bradley more than any insult ever could. "You think you closed a multi-billion-dollar acquisition by logging into a digital clearinghouse and clicking a button?" Ryan stated, his tone perfectly flat. "You think high-level private equity operates like an online shopping cart?" "I have platinum-level executive clearance," Bradley snapped, taking an aggressive step forward. "My digital signature binds Thorn Financial to any contract I deem fit. I overrode the standard compliance checks because I am the executive vice president. I bypassed the legal review because it was slowing down the timeline. I pushed the contract through the final portal, and the system accepted my credentials. The deal is done." Naomi descended the steps from the sweetheart table, the heavy silk of her emerald green bridesmaid dress flowing smoothly around her ankles. She stepped up to flank my left side, holding her ultra-thin tablet in one hand. She looked at her brother, then at me, shaking her head in sheer disbelief. "He really believes it," Naomi said smoothly, pitching her voice so the front rows of tables could hear every single word. "He actually believes that overriding a compliance blockade on a Tier 1 private equity acquisition secures the deal." Bradley pointed a shaking finger at my sister-in-law. "Keep your mouth shut. You do not work for my firm. You do not know what you are talking about." "I know corporate litigation," Bradley. Naomi fired back, her dark eyes flashing with lethal intelligence. "And I know exactly what happens when an unauthorized party forces a unilateral signature through a secure portal on a Saturday afternoon. The system does not just accept your credentials and process the merger, it flags the transaction as an asynchronous security breach. It immediately halts the escrow transfer and sends a catastrophic alert directly to the acquiring firm. Bradley let out a harsh, nervous laugh. He was trying desperately to maintain his facade, but the edges were rapidly fraying. He looked out at the audience, seeking validation from the senior banking executives he had been networking with earlier. He found nothing but averted eyes and grim expressions. The professionals in the room knew exactly what Naomi was describing. They knew Bradley had just detonated a financial bomb. "Vanguard Holdings wants this deal," Bradley shouted into the microphone, his voice echoing loudly. "They do not care whose name is on the digital ink as long as they get the assets. I gave them Thorn Financial. They are not going to halt a multi-billion-dollar merger over a technicality. They are probably popping champagne right now, celebrating the fact that I finally cut the dead weight and pushed this through." Ryan took one slow step forward, placing himself directly between me and Bradley. "Vanguard Holdings is meticulous," Ryan stated, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "They do not merge with liabilities. They demand absolute stability from the executive boards of the companies they acquire. And you, Bradley, just proved to them that Thorn Financial is run by a man who commits corporate fraud on a weekend because his fragile ego felt threatened by a woman getting married." Bradley's face turned an angry, mottled purple. He was backed into a corner, completely outmatched by an intellect he could not comprehend. He refused to accept that he had made a mistake. He doubled down on his delusion, clinging to the only thing he thought gave him power. "You know nothing about Vanguard," Bradley spat, glaring at Ryan with absolute hatred. "You know nothing about my firm. You are just a guy in a rented tuxedo trying to defend a woman who just got publicly fired." He turned his back on Ryan and looked at me, raising the microphone one last time. He wanted to deliver a final crushing blow. He wanted to leave the ballroom feeling victorious. "Your new husband is delusional," Clara Bradley announced, his voice ringing out over the silent crowd. "He is trying to protect your feelings because you are humiliated. But facts are facts. I signed the paperwork. The deal is locked. I secured my legacy today, and you are officially unemployed. You can spin this any way you want, but I won." I smiled. The coldness of the champagne glass I had used to drown his corporate phone still lingered on my fingertips. I did not feel humiliated. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of anticipation. Ryan casually lifted his left arm and checked his watch. It was a vintage piece, completely understated, but incredibly expensive. He stared at the face of the watch for 2 full seconds before looking back up at Bradley. "A deal is not locked until the financial markets close, and the wire transfers clear the compliance deadlines," Ryan said calmly. Bradley scoffed, throwing his free hand in the air. "The deadline is 5 o'clock. We have barely 3 minutes left. It is a done deal. Nothing can stop it now." Naomi looked down at the blazing red alert on her tablet screen, then looked back up at the arrogant, sweating man standing in front of us. Her flawless makeup caught the light from the chandeliers as she offered him a terrifying, brilliant smile. "It is truly fascinating," Naomi said smoothly, her voice carrying a lethal promise. "It is fascinating how you can be so incredibly confident while standing directly on the tracks of an oncoming train." Bradley glared at Naomi, then at Ryan, and finally at me. He was trying desperately to hold on to his narrative. He stood alone on the polished hardwood of the dance floor, breathing heavily, gripping the microphone in his sweaty hand, waiting for the clock to strike 5 and validate his arrogance. He thought he was the smartest man in the room. He thought he had outmaneuvered me, stolen my ultimate victory, and cemented his position as the undisputed king of Thorn Financial. He had absolutely no idea what was about to happen to him. High above the heavy mahogany doors at the far end of the ballroom, a massive antique clock with ornate gold hands steadily ticked away the final seconds of the business day. It was 4:59 and 45 seconds. The grand space was perfectly still, save for the rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat of that clock. Every high net worth guest, every corporate litigator, and every hedge fund manager in the room was holding their breath, their eyes darting between the confident, unbothered posture of my husband and the sweaty, erratic arrogance of the man holding the microphone. Bradley tilted his head back and let out a harsh, mocking laugh. He refused to show weakness. He refused to acknowledge the very real possibility that he had just driven Thorn Financial directly into a brick wall. He gripped the microphone tightly in his right hand and raised his left wrist, deliberately checking his heavy platinum watch. "You people are pathetic," Bradley sneered, his voice carrying an edge of frantic desperation. "You are trying to scare me with technicalities. You are trying to pretend you have some secret knowledge about private equity acquisitions because you cannot handle the fact that I just beat you at your own game." He lowered his wrist and looked directly at me, his eyes gleaming with a malicious, unearned triumph. "It is 5 o'clock," Clara Bradley announced, his voice booming through the speakers. "The financial markets are officially closed. The wire deadlines have cleared. The Vanguard Holdings merger is locked, signed, and finalized. You are out of a job, and I am the man who just doubled the valuation of this firm. You lose." He stood there on the polished hardwood of the dance floor, his chest heaving, waiting for me to shatter. He expected me to fall to my knees. He expected me to finally realize that my career was over and beg him for mercy. I simply folded my hands in front of me and offered him a polite, pleasant smile. For exactly 5 seconds, absolutely nothing happened. The ballroom remained completely silent. Bradley smirked, turning his head to look at Naomi and Ryan, silently gloating that his absolute authority had prevailed. He opened his mouth to deliver another self-congratulatory remark. Then a harsh, violent buzzing sound erupted from his suit jacket. Bradley ignored it. He kept his eyes locked on us, raising the microphone to his lips. But the buzzing did not stop. It intensified into a frantic, continuous vibration that was audible even over the ambient silence of the vast room. Before Bradley could even formulate his next sentence, the screen of his platinum smartwatch illuminated his wrist with a glaring, aggressive red light. The sudden brightness caught his attention. He paused, his arrogant smile faltering for a fraction of a second, and glanced down at his wrist. Whatever he saw on that tiny digital screen made the blood completely drain from his face. His jaw went slack. The hand holding the microphone began to tremble, but it was not just Bradley. A split second later, a chaotic symphony of digital alarms, customized ringtones, and urgent vibration alerts exploded across the entire ballroom. The noise was sudden and overwhelming. Dozens of Thorn Financial board members, senior partners, and risk analysts who had been invited to my wedding simultaneously reached into their suit jackets and designer evening bags. The polite, hushed atmosphere of the luxury reception was instantly shattered by a wave of pure, unfiltered corporate panic. I watched as the senior banking executive sitting 3 tables away pulled out his phone, stared at the screen, and physically choked on his breath. He knocked over his crystal water glass as he scrambled to stand up. 2 tables over, a female board member stared at her glowing device with an expression of absolute, unadulterated horror. She clamped a hand over her mouth, her eyes darting frantically toward Bradley. The digital clearinghouse automated systems had done exactly what I knew they would do. When the clock struck 5, the escrow transfer protocol initiated. The algorithms at Vanguard Holdings scanned the final merger documents submitted by Bradley. The system instantly detected a catastrophic anomaly. The designated lead director of mergers and acquisitions, the only individual legally authorized by Vanguard to execute the transitional integration, had been flagged as terminated in the human resources database. The automated fail-safes engaged immediately. The escrow bounced. The multi-billion-dollar wire transfer was forcefully halted and returned to sender. And then the system blasted an automatic Tier 1 catastrophic failure notification to every single executive and board member connected to the Thorn Financial server. Bradley stood frozen in the center of the dance floor. The heavy microphone slipped from his trembling fingers, hitting the polished wood with a loud, painful feedback screech that made several guests wince. He did not even notice the sound. He reached into his jacket pocket with a shaking hand and pulled out his corporate smartphone. The screen was lit up like a distress beacon. I did not need to see the screen to know exactly what was happening. He was receiving automated alerts from the clearinghouse. He was receiving urgent automated breach notifications from the legal department. And above all of that, the missed call notifications were piling up with terrifying speed. Naomi looked down at her own ultra-thin tablet. She swiped her perfectly manicured finger across the glass, accessing the live regulatory filings. Her dark eyes scanned the fresh data, and a low, highly satisfied hum vibrated in her throat. Asynchronous security breach confirmed. Naomi announced, her voice projecting clearly over the rising panic in the ballroom. The Vanguard Holdings digital portal just executed a forceful rejection of the merger documents. The escrow has been completely frozen. The transaction is officially dead on arrival. Bradley was hyperventilating now. He stared at his phone as if the device itself were physically burning his hand. His chest heaved with shallow, panicked breaths. He tapped the screen frantically, trying to swipe away the alerts, trying to find a message that would tell him this was all just a technical glitch. It was not a glitch. The phone in Bradley's hand began to ring audibly. The caller identification text was so large I could read it from where I stood. It was the chief legal counsel for Thorn Financial. Bradley declined the call, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped the phone. A second later, the phone rang again. It was the chief financial officer. Bradley declined it again. He was paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the disaster he had just orchestrated. The notifications continued to flood his screen in a relentless, unforgiving stream. 50 missed calls, 60 missed calls, 70 missed calls. They were pouring in from every single high-level executive who was currently watching their stock options and their professional legacies evaporate into thin air. Bradley slowly raised his head and looked at me. The arrogant, untouchable executive who had strutted into my wedding reception just 10 minutes ago was entirely gone. He was replaced by a terrified, hollowed-out shell of a man who finally realized he was standing at the edge of an abyss. "What did you do?" Bradley whispered. His voice was raw, broken, and filled with a desperate, childish fear. It lacked the amplification of the microphone, but in the tense proximity of the dance floor, I heard him perfectly. "What did you do to the portal?" "I did not do anything to the portal, Bradley," I replied, my voice steady, calm, and carrying the weight of an executioner. "You are the one who logged into a secure digital clearinghouse. You are the one who bypassed the legal review. You are the one who pushed a unilateral signature through the system. I simply stood here and watched you build your own gallows." Ryan took a step closer, his protective presence an unyielding fortress beside me. "You were warned," Ryan stated, his tone merciless and clinical. "You were explicitly told that high-level private equity does not operate on blind ego. You chose to ignore that warning because you wanted to prove you were the smartest man in the room. Now you get to deal with the consequences of being the most arrogant fool in the industry." Bradley's phone vibrated aggressively in his palm again. He looked down. The counter on his screen updated in real time. He had 92 missed calls. 92 separate individuals who were currently trying to reach him to demand answers for the financial apocalypse he had just triggered. He looked back up at me, his eyes wide, completely devoid of any rational thought. His mouth opened and closed as he struggled to find a way to blame me, a way to spin this disaster, a way to survive the fallout. But there was no spin left. The numbers did not lie. The alerts did not lie. Naomi stepped forward, closing the distance between herself and the trembling executive. She held her tablet loosely at her side, her posture radiating absolute legal authority. "You should probably answer one of those calls," Bradley, Naomi suggested smoothly, "because the failed merger is only the beginning of your problems tonight. The real disaster is the penalty you just activated." The buzzing sound emanating from Bradley's suit jacket was relentless. It was not a single polite notification. It was a continuous, frantic vibration that signaled an absolute corporate emergency. He stood completely frozen on the dance floor, the heavy microphone resting discarded by his expensive leather shoes. For a long, agonizing moment, he refused to reach into his pocket. He seemed to believe that if he simply ignored the sound, the reality of the situation would magically disappear. He wanted to stay in his fantasy, where he was the undisputed king of Thorn Financial. But the buzzing grew louder. A second phone, a personal device in his inner pocket, began to ring with a harsh, generic chime. His heavy platinum smartwatch illuminated his wrist, flashing a bright crimson warning light. The digital onslaught was impossible to ignore. Bradley swallowed hard. His throat clicked audibly in the quiet ballroom. His arrogant posture collapsed, his shoulders slumping forward as if an invisible weight had just been dropped directly onto his spine. With a slow, trembling hand, he reached into his tailored jacket and pulled out his corporate smartphone. The bright light from the screen illuminated his sweating face. I stood just a few feet away, watching his expression morph from stubborn denial into pure, unadulterated terror. The lock screen was a digital bloodbath. It was an endless, cascading waterfall of critical emergency notifications. Red banners overlapped one another, multiplying faster than the screen could refresh. They were automated system alerts from the secure digital clearinghouse. I knew exactly what those alerts said because I had engineered the fail-safes myself. They read catastrophic failure escrow rejected and unauthorized signatory detected. Bradley stared at the device, his eyes darting frantically across the text. His breathing became shallow and rapid. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing in the middle of a burning building with no exits. Then the true panic set in. The red banners were instantly pushed aside by an incoming phone call. The caller identification text was massive. It was David, my lead compliance director. Bradley stared at the name. He knew David was currently looking at a server log that showed Bradley had bypassed every single legal protocol to force a multi-billion-dollar acquisition through a locked portal. Bradley did not answer. He let it ring. The second the call rolled over to voicemail, the phone immediately began ringing again. This time the caller ID showed the chief financial officer of Thorn Financial. A man who had previously ignored Bradley entirely was now calling him with the desperate urgency of a man watching his stock options vaporize. Bradley's thumb hovered over the green accept button, but his hand was shaking too violently. He could not bring himself to press the screen. He knew what the chief financial officer was going to say. He knew the man was going to demand answers for why the firm was suddenly facing a catastrophic breach of contract. The phone rang and rang and rang until it finally disconnected. A small red notification bubble appeared at the top corner of the screen. I watched the number inside that bubble tick upward in real time. It went from 80 to 85, then to 89. Then it stopped at 92. 92 missed calls. In the span of exactly 3 minutes since the financial markets closed, 92 separate individuals had attempted to contact the new executive vice president. They were board members, senior risk analysts, and legal partners. They were the most powerful people in the company, and they were all currently watching their professional legacies detonate because of his monumental stupidity. And then a new call took over the screen. This time, the caller ID did not show a title. It just showed a name. Richard Thorne, the chief executive officer, Bradley's father. Bradley let out a sharp, pathetic gasp. The sight of his father's name completely broke whatever fragile composure he had left. The blood entirely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. He looked down at the ringing phone with an expression of absolute paralyzing dread. He tried to answer it. He desperately needed to explain himself, to spin a narrative to blame someone else before his father could review the digital server logs. He raised his trembling thumb and pressed down on the glass screen. But his hands were shaking so severely that his thumb slipped. He hit the wrong side of the screen. Instead of accepting the call, he accidentally swiped the red button. He declined his own father's call in the middle of a corporate apocalypse. Bradley stared at the rejected call screen, his mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. He fumbled with the device, frantically tapping the screen to unlock it so he could call his father back. But his fingers were slipping on the smooth glass. He typed in his passcode, but his hands were trembling so much he entered the wrong numbers. A security warning flashed on the screen, locking him out of the device for 1 full minute. He was completely locked out of his own communication network while the firm burned to the ground. Naomi took a slow, deliberate step forward. She looked at the panicked executive with a cold, clinical fascination. "You really should have answered that, Bradley," Naomi said, her voice smooth and devoid of any sympathy. "Because right now your father is staring at a digital dashboard that says Thorn Financial just committed a severe violation of a private equity acquisition protocol. He is staring at a failed escrow transfer, and most importantly, He is staring at a digital signature log that bears your exact name. Bradley looked up at Naomi, his eyes wide and unfocused. He shook his head back and forth, a desperate, childish denial of reality. The system made a mistake. Bradley stammered, his voice cracking horribly. The portal glitched. I submitted the paperwork correctly. I bypassed the compliance blocks because I had executive authority. The clearinghouse is just experiencing a server delay. Ryan let out a low, dark chuckle. He shifted his weight, his presence radiating an overwhelming, crushing authority. There is no server delay, Ryan stated flatly. The clearinghouse algorithms operate with absolute precision. They scan for unauthorized variables. They detected that the lead director of mergers and acquisitions, the only person contractually authorized to supervise the Vanguard transition, was suddenly missing from the employment registry. The algorithm did exactly what it was programmed to do. It rejected a fraudulent transaction to protect the acquiring firm from taking on a massive, unmitigated liability. You are the liability, Bradley, Naomi added, dealing a brutal intellectual strike. You wanted to prove you were the smartest man in the room. You wanted to bypass the legal team and steal the glory. Well, congratulations. You just successfully attached your digital signature to the most expensive corporate failure in Chicago history. The board of directors is not experiencing a glitch. They are currently convening an emergency tribunal to figure out how quickly they can strip you of your title to save themselves from federal regulatory investigations. Bradley looked around the ballroom. The 200 high-net-worth guests were watching him with expressions ranging from pity to absolute disgust. The senior banking executives he had tried to network with earlier were actively turning their backs on him, distancing themselves from a man who was now considered professionally radioactive. He had marched into my wedding reception to humiliate me, but he had only succeeded in providing a front-row seat to his own public execution. He looked down at his locked corporate phone. The screen was dark, but he knew the missed calls were still piling up. He knew his father was currently screaming at the legal department, demanding to know why his son had just tanked a multi-billion-dollar deal. Bradley could not process his own failure. His massive, fragile ego simply could not accept that his incompetence was the sole cause of this disaster. His mind fractured under the intense pressure, desperately searching for a scapegoat. He needed someone to blame. He needed a target. Slowly, Bradley raised his head. His pale, terrified eyes locked directly onto mine. The arrogant swagger was completely gone. The smug, condescending smile had been erased. He was just a terrified boy wearing a suit that was too big for him, staring at the woman he had foolishly tried to destroy. He took a small, unsteady step toward me. His hands remained at his sides, gripping the dark smartphone so tightly his knuckles turned stark white. He looked at my calm, serene expression, and a deep, primal fear settled into his features. "What did you do?" he whispered. "I did not do a single thing to the portal," I told him, keeping my voice perfectly level and completely devoid of sympathy. "You did this entirely to yourself." Naomi stepped forward. She moved with the sleek, predatory grace of a woman who had just trapped her prey in an inescapable corner. She reached into her structured designer handbag and pulled out a thick, heavily bound stack of legal documents. The crisp sound of the thick paper cut through the heavy silence of the ballroom. She held the contract up, the bright lights from the chandeliers catching the bold black ink on the cover page. "You see, Bradley," Naomi said, her tone conversational, but absolutely lethal. "When you decided to play corporate titan this afternoon, you made a fatal amateur mistake. You logged into the clearinghouse and you clicked sign, but you did not actually read the final transition agreement. You assumed it was standard boilerplate text. You assumed the terms were identical to the preliminary drafts from 3 months ago." Bradley stared at the thick stack of paper in her hand. He was shaking so badly his knees looked ready to give out. "I read it," he stammered, his voice cracking with panic. "I read the entire file. It was a standard private equity acquisition." "No, it was a specialized acquisition," Naomi corrected him, taking a step closer. "And specialized acquisitions come with highly specific addendums. Addendums that Clara negotiated directly with Vanguard Holdings over the past 2 weeks. Addendums that your legal department completely missed because you locked them out of the final review process today." Naomi flipped open the heavy contract. She bypassed the first 50 pages of financial jargon and stopped at a specific section marked with a bright red tab. She looked up at the 200 guests watching her, ensuring she had the absolute attention of every single financial professional in the room. Let us review Section 4, Article 9, Naomi announced, her voice projecting clearly across the dance floor. It is commonly known in elite financial circles as a key person clause. Vanguard Holdings is not a charity. They do not hand over billions of dollars to a firm run by a man who treats his top executives like disposable assets. They investigated Thorn Financial thoroughly. They looked at your quarterly projections, your risk models, and your leadership structure. And they came to a very simple, undeniable conclusion. The only valuable asset in your entire building is Clara. Bradley shook his head violently. That is a lie. I am the executive vice president. My father is the chief executive officer. We built that firm. You inherited that firm, Ryan corrected him quietly from my side. Clara is the one who kept it alive, and Vanguard knew it. Naomi looked back down at the contract in her hands. Vanguard Holdings explicitly stated that this entire acquisition was completely contingent upon Clara maintaining her active status as lead director of mergers and acquisitions. She is the key person. The contract clearly states that if Clara is terminated, demoted, or reassigned without her explicit written consent, the acquiring firm reserves the right to instantly terminate the acquisition. Bradley's eyes widened in sheer terror as the reality of her words crashed down on his shoulders. Naomi continued reading, mercilessly driving the nail into his coffin. But you did not just terminate her, Bradley. You fired her without cause. You fired her via text message on her wedding day. And then mere hours later, you logged into a secure federal portal and forcefully executed a signature on a contract that you yourself had already invalidated. I did not know. Bradley gasped, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. I did not know about the clause. I am the vice president. Nobody told me. Ignorance is not a valid legal defense, Naomi stated smoothly. You claimed you had absolute authority. You bragged on a hot microphone that you bypassed the board of directors. By forcing that signature through the portal while Clara was officially terminated in your human resources system, you essentially submitted a fraudulent contract to a private equity titan. You triggered the automated rejection yourself. You voided the multi-billion-dollar deal. The ballroom erupted into a low, frantic murmur. The senior executives from Thorn Financial who had been invited to my wedding were suddenly scrambling out of their chairs. They were pulling out their own phones, desperately trying to call their brokers, trying to figure out how quickly they could dump their company stock on Monday morning. They knew a voided contract of this magnitude would send the firm's overall valuation into a catastrophic nosedive. But Naomi was not finished. She let the panic simmer for a few seconds before she raised her hand, demanding silence. The room quieted down immediately, eager to hear the rest of the execution. A voided contract is certainly a tragedy for your shareholders, Naomi said, her dark eyes locking onto Bradley with absolute devastation. But the Vanguard legal team is incredibly thorough. They do not just walk away from a fraudulent transaction, they penalize it. Naomi flipped to the very last page of the heavy document. Section 4. Article 10. Naomi read aloud, her voice ringing out like a judge delivering a final sentence. The penalty clause. In the event that Thorn Financial breaches the key person agreement and subsequently attempts to execute the acquisition under false pretenses, Thorn Financial shall be held immediately liable for a punitive breach of contract fine. Bradley took a stumbling step backward. He looked like he was going to be physically sick right there on the polished hardwood of the dance floor. How much, Bradley whispered. His voice was so small, so completely defeated, that it barely carried past the first row of tables. Naomi smiled her terrifying, brilliant smile. $50 million. A collective gasp ripped through the audience. Even Ryan let out an impressed low whistle next to me. $50 million, Naomi repeated, savoring the taste of the words. Payable immediately upon the automated rejection of the escrow transfer. It is a non-negotiable, non-refundable penalty. And because you bypass the board of directors and sign the document with your own executive credentials, you are personally responsible for triggering that massive liability. Bradley dropped to his knees. The sudden movement sent a shockwave through the guests standing nearby. He landed heavily on the floor, his expensive designer suit wrinkling around his shaking frame. He stared up at me from the ground, his face completely devoid of color, covered in a cold, panicked sweat. "You set me up," Bradley choked out, his voice cracking violently. "You knew I would fire you. You knew I wanted to take over the deal. You put that clause in there to destroy me." I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, pure satisfaction. "I did not set you up, Bradley. I protected my own value. I secured an insurance policy against your massive unchecked ego. I knew that the second the ink was dry on the preliminary terms, you would try to eliminate me so you could steal the glory. You fired me because you are a coward. You signed the contract because you are arrogant. I did not force you to do either of those things." He was openly hyperventilating now. He scrambled forward on his knees, reaching out as if to grab the hem of my silk wedding dress. Ryan immediately shifted, blocking Bradley's path with his leg, a silent but absolute warning not to come any closer. Bradley looked up at me, tears of pure terror welling in his red eyes. He knew his career was over. He knew the $50 million penalty would instantly trigger the debt covenants on Thorn Financial's existing corporate loans. He knew he had just bankrupted his father's empire in less than 3 minutes. "Clara, please," Bradley begged, his voice rising to a frantic, hysterical pitch. "Please, you have to fix this. You have to call them. You know the Vanguard executives. You can talk to them. You can tell them it was a mistake." I looked down at him, my expression perfectly serene. "A mistake?" "Yes," Bradley stammered, nodding frantically, desperately clawing for a lifeline. "It was a mistake. It was a joke. I was just stressed about the merger. I was just blowing off steam. The text message was just a prank, a wedding prank. I will rehire you. Right now. I will double your salary. I will make you a senior partner. Just call Vanguard and tell them you are still the lead director. Please, Clara. I am begging you. I will give you whatever you want." I stared at the pathetic, broken man kneeling on the floor of my wedding reception. He was begging for his professional life. He was offering me titles and money that he no longer possessed, desperately hoping that my corporate loyalty would override my self-respect. He still thought of me as the workhorse, the woman who would step in and clean up his catastrophic messes to save the firm. I took a slow step back, aligning myself perfectly with my new husband and my brilliant sister-in-law. I looked Bradley dead in the eye and delivered the final fatal blow to his delusion. "You cannot afford me anymore." The ballroom remained suspended in that absolute breathless silence, following my final words to Bradley. He stayed on his knees, his expensive designer suit pooled around him on the polished floor, staring up at me with vacant, ruined eyes. He was completely out of options. There were no more empty threats he could make, no more unearned titles he could hide behind. He was just a terrified boy, realizing he had broken a highly expensive machine and lacked the intellect to put the pieces back together. Before anyone in the crowd could even murmur a response to the devastating reality of the $50 million penalty, a massive, violent sound shattered the quiet of the reception. The heavy mahogany doors at the far end of the ballroom burst open with such incredible force that they slammed loudly against the ornate wall fixtures. The sheer impact echoed across the high ceilings, causing several guests to physically jump in their seats. The venue security guards posted outside were shoved aside, completely powerless to stop the man who had just barged into my wedding reception. It was Richard Thorn. The chief executive officer of Thorn Financial was a man who usually commanded a room through sheer intimidating presence. He was typically flanked by executive assistants impeccably tailored and radiating an aura of untouchable wealth and absolute authority. He thrived on projecting total control. But the man marching down the center aisle of the ballroom right now looked completely unrecognizable. Richard was ashen. His skin possessed a sickly pale gray hue that made him look a full decade older than his actual age. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving as if he had literally sprinted multiple city blocks to get here. His expensive silk tie was yanked loose around his neck, and his suit jacket was unbuttoned and deeply rumpled. He was clutching his smartphone in his right hand so tightly that his knuckles were stark white. He looked exactly like a man who had just watched his entire financial empire evaporate into thin air. The guests parted for him immediately. The hedge fund managers and senior banking executives, people who usually clamored for a single moment of Richard Thorne's time, physically stepped back to get out of his way. They could smell the panic rolling off him, and in the corporate world, desperation is highly contagious. No one wanted to be caught in the blast radius of a failing chief executive officer. Bradley heard the heavy footsteps approaching across the hardwood floor. He scrambled to his feet, nearly tripping over the hem of his own trousers in his haste. He spun around and saw his father marching across the dance floor. A fresh wave of sheer primal terror washed over his face. He held his hands up instantly, shifting into the defensive whining posture of a child caught stealing from the register. "Dad," Bradley gasped, his voice pitching upward in frantic desperation. "Dad, you have to listen to me. I can explain everything." It was a technical glitch with the digital portal. The clearinghouse algorithm malfunctioned. Clara set up a trap in the contract to sabotage the firm. "I did not know about the clause. I was just trying to close the deal today like you wanted." Richard did not slow his pace. He did not deviate from his path. He marched straight toward our sweetheart table, his eyes locked entirely on me. "Dad, please," Bradley begged, reaching out to grab his father's sleeve as Richard passed him. "I can fix this. I just need you to call the board of directors and tell them to give me a minute to sort out the compliance block." Richard did not even blink. He did not turn his head. He did not acknowledge his son with a single word or a single glance. He violently ripped his arm away from Bradley's grasp, treating his newly appointed executive vice president like an annoying pest that had briefly brushed against his jacket. Bradley stumbled backward, completely dismissed and entirely erased from his father's focus. Richard stopped 2 feet in front of me. Ryan immediately shifted his stance, moving his shoulder forward just a fraction of an inch, creating a solid physical barrier between me and the CEO. Naomi stood perfectly still on my other side, her tablet resting against her hip, her dark eyes evaluating Richard with clinical precision. We were an impenetrable front. I looked at the man who had controlled my professional life for 5 grueling years. I waited for the explosion. I waited for the roaring anger, the vicious threats, and the loud, booming voice he used to terrorize junior analysts in the boardroom. I braced myself for a massive public shouting match, but Richard did not yell. He looked at my calm, serene expression, and then he looked at the devastating array of power standing beside me in the form of my new husband and my brilliant sister-in-law. He looked at the 200 elite guests watching his every move, and then the untouchable CEO of Thorne Financial did something I never thought I would witness in my lifetime. His shoulders slumped, the remaining fight completely draining out of his body. He lowered his head slightly, breaking eye contact for a fleeting moment before looking back up at me. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with an absolute raw panic. "He begged," Clara Richard said. His voice was a hoarse, ragged whisper. It lacked any trace of authority. It was the sound of a man drowning and reaching blindly for a life raft. "Clara, please, you have to stop this." I stood perfectly still, letting the sheer weight of his desperation hang in the air between us. "You have to call Vanguard Holdings right now," Richard pleaded, taking a small, hesitant step forward, only to be stopped by Ryan's unyielding presence. "You have the direct line to their transition team. You know the exact people running their compliance department. You have to call them and tell them this was a massive internal miscommunication. Tell them the termination notice was a human resources error. Tell them you are still the lead director and that you are fully committed to closing this acquisition on Monday morning." He was speaking rapidly, the words tumbling out in a frantic rush. He was completely ignoring the reality of the situation, desperately trying to rewrite the past hour through sheer willpower. "Richard," Fry said quietly, my voice smooth and untroubled. "I cannot do that. You know I cannot do that. The digital signature has already been processed and forcefully rejected by their automated system. The escrow is frozen. The penalty clause has been irrevocably triggered. The deal is dead. No, the deal is not dead, Richard insisted, shaking his head frantically. It is only dead if you walk away. You built this merger, Clara. You spent months cultivating the relationship with Vanguard Holdings. They trust you. They respect your judgment. If you call them right now and assure them that the executive team at Thorn Financial is stable, they will lift the freeze on the escrow. They will waive the breach of contract penalty. We can salvage this. I tilted my head, looking at him with mild curiosity. Salvage this, Bradley fired me via text message on my wedding day, Richard. He publicly humiliated me and then bragged about stealing my work. Why on earth would I lift a single finger to salvage your firm? Because we are family. Richard gasped, grasping at the most toxic, manipulative weapon in his corporate arsenal. We have been like family for 5 years, Clara. I mentored you. I brought you up through the ranks. I gave you the platform to become the brilliant director you are today. You cannot just throw all of that away over one stupid mistake made by my idiot son. He pointed a shaking finger blindly behind him, gesturing toward Bradley without even looking at him. He is done. Richard stated, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. Bradley is gone. I will terminate his employment tonight. I will personally strip him of his title, his corner office, and his shares. I will frog march him out of the building myself. You can have his job, Clara. I will make you the executive vice president. I will double your salary. I will give you a seat on the board of directors. Whatever you want, it is yours. Just pick up the phone and fix this. The sheer audacity of his bargaining was staggering. He was offering me the very things I had already earned 10 times over through my own exhausting labor, but framing them as generous gifts he was willing to bestow upon me to save his own skin. He truly believed he could buy my loyalty after allowing his son to treat me like a disposable asset. I looked at the desperate, broken CEO standing in front of me, and a cold, pure clarity settled over my mind. He was not begging for my sake. He was begging for his legacy. He was begging for his wealth. He was trying to use the concept of corporate family loyalty to chain me to a sinking ship. Richard stepped closer, or tried to, but Ryan's shoulder remained an impenetrable barrier. Richard looked at my husband with a flash of irritation before forcing his expression back into a mask of paternal desperation. He looked at me with wide, pleading eyes. Clara, listen to me. Richard said, his voice lowering into that familiar persuasive tone he used in boardrooms. I know Bradley crossed a line today. I know he let his ego get the better of him. But you have to look at the bigger picture. We have been like family for 5 years. I took a chance on you when you were just a senior analyst. I mentored you. I brought you into the inner circle. I stared at him, feeling the absolute absurdity of his words. You took a chance on me because I was the only analyst willing to work through the weekends to fix the portfolio deficits your son created, I replied, keeping my voice perfectly steady. Richard shook his head, pressing his hands together as if in prayer. I made you the lead director because I believed in you. I gave you the platform to shine. And you did. You built this Vanguard deal. It is your masterpiece. You cannot let my son's stupidity bankrupt my life's work. You cannot let a petty personal grudge destroy the legacy we built together. We did not build a legacy together, I corrected him. I built a lifeline, and you used it to fund your country club memberships while paying me a fraction of my actual market value. Richard flinched, but he refused to drop the benevolent father act. He reached out his hand, palm up, offering a gesture of surrender. I am admitting fault, Clara. I am standing here in front of your friends and family admitting that I should have reined Bradley in. I am offering you the ultimate vindication. We will fire him tonight. I will have security escort him out of the building. You can have his job. You can have the executive vice president title. Just pick up your phone, call the Vanguard transition team, and fix this. I am not going to fix this, I said cleanly. Richard's hand dropped. The pleading look in his eyes began to harden. Clara, you are letting your emotions cloud your business judgment. This is a $50 million penalty. It will trigger the debt covenants on our corporate loans. It will initiate a complete liquidation of Thorn Financial. Hundreds of people will lose their jobs because you are throwing a tantrum over a text message. Do not dare weaponize the employees of that firm against me. I fired back, my voice echoing sharply across the dance floor. I spent 5 years protecting those jobs. I structured the Vanguard acquisition specifically to ensure that the rank and file employees retained their positions and their benefits. Your son is the one who fired the lead architect of the deal. Your son is the one who logged into a federal portal and committed corporate fraud. If Thorn Financial liquidates tomorrow, it is entirely because you placed nepotism above competence. Richard's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. He was rapidly running out of patience. He looked at Naomi, who was watching him with a predatory smile, and then he looked at Ryan. Tell your wife to be reasonable, Richard demanded, addressing Ryan as if my husband were my handler. Tell her to stop this ridiculous posturing before she ruins her own career along with mine. Ryan did not blink. He looked at Richard with an expression of absolute disgust. My wife is being entirely reasonable, Ryan said quietly. She is refusing to negotiate with a man who allowed his son to terrorize her for years, and I suggest you lower your voice when speaking to her. Richard scoffed, his hands curling into tight fists at his sides. The benevolent mentor mask was slipping, revealing the ruthless, manipulative tyrant underneath. You are making a catastrophic mistake, Clara, Richard snarled, abandoning the paternal act completely. His voice grew loud, harsh, and filled with venom. You think you hold all the cards because the clearinghouse rejected the escrow. You think you can hold me hostage for a better title or a higher salary, but you are forgetting who you are dealing with. I did not move a single muscle. I know exactly who I am dealing with. You owe me! Richard shouted, stepping as close to Ryan's barrier as he dared. You owe me for every opportunity you have ever had in this city. I made you who you are. Before I promoted you, you were nothing. And if you do not pick up that phone and salvage this merger right now, I will make sure you are nothing again. The 200 guests in the ballroom watched in stunned silence as the CEO of Thorn Financial completely unraveled. I will tie you up in litigation for the next decade, Richard threatened, his face contorted with rage. I will sue you for corporate sabotage. I will claim you intentionally engineered this contract to destroy the firm. I will blacklist you from every financial institution in Chicago. You will never work in private equity again. You will be toxic. Naomi let out a sharp, genuine laugh. It was a beautiful musical sound that cut right through Richard's toxic tirade. She stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with me. You are threatening to blacklist a woman who just proved she is the only valuable asset in your entire company, Naomi said, her tone dripping with mockery. You are threatening to sue my client for corporate sabotage when your own son proudly confessed on a microphone that he fired her and bypassed the board of directors. I would absolutely love to see you try to present that case to a judge, Richard. I will personally take it pro bono just for the sheer entertainment value. Richard glared at Naomi, his chest heaving. He realized he could not intimidate her. He turned his furious gaze back to me. You think this is a game? Richard spat, his voice shaking with absolute fury. You think you can just walk away and leave me holding the bag for a $50 million penalty? But Vanguard Holdings is not going to let this slide. They invested millions in the preliminary audits. They dedicated months to the risk assessments. They want this acquisition, and they are going to demand answers for why it failed. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. When the CEO of Vanguard Holdings finds out that you intentionally tanked a multi-billion-dollar deal just to settle a personal score with my son, they will destroy you, Richard growled, trying to instill the fear of God into me. They will bury you in civil suits. They have resources you cannot even fathom. You think you are so untouchable right now, Clara. But you wait until the Vanguard Executive Board comes after you for acting in bad faith. You think the Vanguard CEO will let you get away with this? I looked at the furious, desperate man who had tormented me for years. He was banking his entire threat on the terrifying anonymous power of the Vanguard Holdings chief executive officer. He was hoping that the sheer mention of the private equity titan would force me into submission. I did not submit. I simply smiled. Family. I repeated the word out loud, letting the sheer absurdity of it wash over the silent ballroom. The sound of my own laugh was sharp, brittle, and utterly devoid of humor. I looked at the desperate, sweating man standing in front of me and felt a lifetime of corporate submission evaporate from my shoulders. "You want to talk about family, Richard?" I asked, taking a deliberate step forward. "Let us talk about how you define that word." Ryan did not hold me back. He shifted his weight, moving fluidly beside me, acting as a silent, absolute barrier of protection. "You did not treat me like family 2 years ago during the Houston logistics buyout," I stated, my voice projecting with a crystalline authority that commanded the attention of every single guest in the venue. "I spent 48 straight hours in a windowless conference room, surviving on black coffee and sheer willpower, fixing the massive valuation deficits your son had carelessly approved. I missed my best friend's funeral to keep Thorne Financial from bleeding out in federal court. And when the ink was finally dry, you stood in front of the financial press and put your arm around Bradley. You told the world he was a visionary. You told the shareholders he was the future of the firm. You did not even invite me to the closing dinner." Richard opened his mouth, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson, but I cut him down before he could formulate a single syllable. "I am not finished," I commanded. "Let us talk about the biomedical acquisition last winter. I negotiated those hostile terms while I was running a fever of 102 degrees. You called my hospital room, Richard. You called my hospital room not to ask if I was recovering, but to demand I submit the revised contracts before the market closed. And my reward for that unrelenting loyalty, you gave Bradley the corner office and a massive cash bonus, while handing me a standard cost of living adjustment." Richard's hands clenched into trembling fists at his sides. He was a tyrant who operated behind closed, soundproof doors, bullying subordinates into terrified compliance. He was entirely unequipped to handle a public, merciless dismantling in front of his peers, his investors, and his rivals. "That is the nature of the industry." Richard snarled, his voice thick with defensive rage. He was desperately trying to justify his exploitation. "You were compensated for your time. You signed an employment contract. You do not get to stand here and dictate the hierarchy of my company just because you feel underappreciated." "I do not want your hierarchy." I fired back, the absolute certainty of my words pinning him to the floor. "I want you to look at me and admit exactly what you are. You are a parasite, Richard. You systematically fed off my intellect, my drive, and my exhaustion to keep your incompetent son in sports cars and designer suits. You willfully overlooked every single highly qualified female executive in your building, choosing instead to promote men who could barely read a balance sheet simply because they shared your last name or played golf at your exclusive country club." I gestured gracefully toward the empty sweetheart table behind me, covered in cascading white roses and untouched crystal glasses. "You didn't treat me like family when I made you 50 million last quarter, Richard. You treated me like a workhorse." The truth of that statement hung heavily in the air. The 200 high net worth individuals seated at the surrounding tables were absolutely captivated. Corporate titans do not get dressed down in public. They hide their sins behind non-disclosure agreements and quiet severance packages. I was ripping the doors off the hinges, dragging his toxic leadership into the harsh, unforgiving light. Richard was breathing heavily, his chest heaving beneath his rumpled suit jacket. The paternal, benevolent mask he had worn for the past 5 years was completely shattered, leaving behind nothing but a desperate, cornered animal. He looked down at his son, who was still kneeling on the hardwood floor, staring blankly at the dark screen of a corporate phone, completely paralyzed by his own monumental failure. "You handed a child a loaded weapon." I continued, my gaze merciless. "You handed him an executive title and turned a blind eye because it was easier than actually managing his destructive behavior. You thought I would just take the abuse forever. You thought I would quietly pack up my desk, accept my measly severance, and let you steal the Vanguard merger. You severely underestimated me." Richard's eyes darted frantically around the room. He saw his major investors whispering to one another. He saw the managing partners of rival firms watching his empire burn to ash with unconcealed amusement. He realized that appealing to my non-existent loyalty was a catastrophic failure. He realized he could not guilt me into saving his legacy, so he resorted to the only tactic he had left: pure, unadulterated terror. Richard straightened his ruined suit jacket, his jaw setting into a rigid, hostile line. If he could not manipulate me, he would try to destroy me. You think you have orchestrated some brilliant revenge? Richard spat, his voice dropping to a harsh, venomous register that carried a terrifying promise of retribution. You think you can engineer a multi-billion-dollar collapse and just walk away in your pretty white dress? You are a fool, Clara. I stood my ground, my expression entirely placid. Naomi let out a soft, highly amused breath next to me, adjusting her grip on her ultra-thin tablet. Vanguard Holdings is not going to applaud your little stunt, Richard growled, taking a highly aggressive step forward. Ryan instantly shifted his shoulder, brushing mine, a silent but absolute warning that Richard was not to come a single inch closer. Richard glared at my husband before turning his furious eyes back to me. They invested massive amounts of capital into the preliminary audits for this merger. Richard threatened, his voice rising in volume. They dedicated their top legal teams to this acquisition for the past 6 months. Vanguard Holdings does not tolerate bad faith actors. And they certainly do not tolerate mid-level directors intentionally sabotaging their high-yield portfolios to settle a personal vendetta. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face, his eyes wild with malice and desperation. I will make sure Vanguard knows exactly what you did. Richard snarled, spit flying from his lips. I will personally contact their executive board on Monday morning. I will tell them you intentionally built a trap into the contract. I will tell them you orchestrated this breach out of pure malicious spite. They will come after you with an army of corporate litigators. They will freeze your bank accounts, Clara. They will bury you in civil suits until you cannot even afford the rent on a studio apartment. He was breathing heavily, his face a mask of absolute hatred. He was banking his entire threat on the terrifying, anonymous power of the private equity titan. He was hoping that the sheer mention of the acquiring firm's wrath would finally break my composure and force me into terrified submission. You think the Vanguard CEO will let you get away with this? He spits. The sheer desperate volume of Richard's threat hung in the still air of the ballroom. He was banking everything on the terrifying anonymous specter of the Vanguard Holdings chief executive officer. He was hoping that invoking the wrath of a private equity titan would finally force me to shatter, to drop to my knees, and to beg for my job back so I could save his crumbling empire. I did not shatter. I did not even blink. Before the echo of his shouting could fade into the high vaulted ceilings of the venue, a warm, solid weight settled firmly against the lower curve of my spine. It was Ryan. My husband stepped forward, closing the microscopic gap between us, until his shoulder was aligned perfectly with mine. His physical presence was a sudden, immovable fortress. Throughout the entire evening, Ryan had remained mostly quiet, sipping his bourbon and watching the chaos unfold with the detached amusement of a man who already knew the final score. He had let Naomi and me dismantle the junior executives. He had let me verbally execute Bradley. He had allowed Richard to completely exhaust his arsenal of empty, pathetic threats. But now the game was over. Ryan did not raise his voice. He did not puff out his chest or posture aggressively like the two terrified men standing in front of us. He simply looked Richard dead in the eye with an expression of profound, devastating authority. Actually, Ryan said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that carried perfectly across the silent dance floor. The Vanguard chief executive officer is perfectly fine with it. Richard stopped breathing. His face, which had been flushed a violent, angry crimson just seconds prior, suddenly froze in an expression of pure, unadulterated confusion. His brow furrowed deeply. He looked at Ryan as if my husband had just spoken to him in a foreign language. Richard's brain, clouded by panic and rage, simply could not process why the groom was interjecting himself into a high-level corporate standoff. "Excuse me." Richard snapped, his voice dripping with venomous condescension. "This is a private equity crisis. This is a multi-billion-dollar financial sector disaster. I am not talking to you. Keep your mouth shut and stay out of corporate business." Ryan did not flinch at the insult. A slow, dark, highly dangerous smile spread across his handsome face. He looked at Richard with the exact same pity a predator reserves for trapped prey. Naomi moved instantly. My sister-in-law stepped gracefully to Ryan's side, her emerald green bridesmaid dress rustling softly against the polished hardwood. She did not argue with Richard. She did not offer a sharp legal rebuttal. She simply unclasped her structured designer handbag and reached inside. With the smooth, practiced elegance of a senior corporate litigator delivering a fatal piece of evidence, Naomi pulled out a single piece of heavy cardstock. It was a business card. It was not a standard flimsy white rectangle printed in bulk. It was a thick, matte black card, with distinct minimalist silver foil lettering embossed across the center. It was the kind of card that did not belong in a normal wallet. It belonged in the boardrooms of international banks and the private lounges of exclusive investment firms. Naomi extended her arm, holding the black card out directly in front of Richard's chest. I highly suggest you read that Richard, Naomi advised, her tone dripping with a lethal sugary sweetness. Before you say another word to my brother. Richard looked at the card hovering in the air. He hesitated. His eyes darted nervously between Naomi's serene face, my completely untroubled expression, and Ryan's cold, calculating smile. His instincts, honed by decades of corporate survival, were screaming at him that something was catastrophically wrong. But his arrogance forced him to move. He reached out with a trembling, sweaty hand and snatched the heavy black card from Naomi's fingers. He brought it up to his face, adjusting his vision to read the minimalist silver text. I watched his eyes scan the first line, then the second line. The physical transformation was immediate and absolute. The last remaining drops of blood entirely drained from Richard's face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent white. His jaw went completely slack, his mouth dropping open in a silent, horrified gasp. His knees actually buckled slightly, as if the physical weight of the small piece of paper in his hand was suddenly too heavy to bear. He stared at the card, his eyes wide and unblinking. Printed in gleaming silver foil right across the top was the iconic, sharply angled logo of Vanguard Holdings. Beneath the logo, printed in perfectly spaced typography, was a single name, Ryan Gallagher, and beneath the name was the title that caused Richard's entire world to spontaneously combust: founder and majority shareholder. Richard's hands began to shake so violently that the thick black card rattled in his grip. He slowly, agonizingly tore his eyes away from the silver text and looked up at my husband. Ryan looked back at him, his dark eyes radiating an overwhelming, crushing power. "You," Richard whispered. The sound was broken, hoarse, and entirely devoid of the booming, tyrannical authority he had wielded just moments before. It was the sound of a man realizing he had just threatened to destroy the very deity who controlled his universe. "You are Vanguard." "I am Ryan," confirmed quietly. A collective electrified shockwave rippled through the 200 guests watching the exchange. The senior banking executives, the hedge fund managers, and the elite investors seated at the surrounding tables began whispering frantically to one another. Everyone in the Chicago financial district knew the name Vanguard Holdings. It was a massive, aggressive private equity firm known for swallowing struggling corporations whole, but very few people knew the actual face of the man who owned it. Ryan was a ghost in the financial sector. He employed a highly visible, charismatic chief executive officer to handle the press conferences, the media interviews, and the public-facing operations. The public CEO was merely a highly paid operator. Ryan was the architect. He owned the controlling shares. He sat on the executive board in total silence, pulling the strings from the shadows, evaluating companies and identifying weaknesses without ever stepping into the spotlight. It was my favorite thing about him. It was the secret we shared in the dark of our bedroom while I was exhausted from dealing with Bradley's incompetence. Ryan understood the corporate grind because he owned the grind. Richard could not breathe. He was audibly gasping for air, staring at Ryan as if my husband had just returned from the dead. He looked from Ryan to me, his eyes wide with a horrifying realization. "You knew!" Richard stammered, pointing a trembling, sweaty finger at me. "You knew who he was!" I smiled, stepping closer to my husband and resting my hand lightly against his tuxedo jacket. "Of course I knew Richard. Who do you think brought Vanguard Holdings to the negotiation table in the first place? I did not just stumble into a multi-billion-dollar acquisition by accident. I curated it. I presented the Thorn financial portfolios directly to Ryan 6 months ago. Richard staggered backward, bumping heavily into his son. Bradley was still kneeling on the floor, weeping silently, completely useless. Richard looked down at his ruined, incompetent heir, and then looked back at the billionaire standing in front of him. The threat Richard had screamed just minutes ago echoed mockingly in his own ears. He had threatened to call the Vanguard Executive Board to destroy me. He had threatened to tell the Vanguard leadership that I was a liability. He had screamed those threats directly into the face of the man who literally owned the Vanguard empire. "You are the majority shareholder." Richard breathed, his voice cracking violently under the sheer strain of his terror. "You hold the ultimate authority on all Vanguard acquisitions. You hold the penalty clauses." "Yes, I do," Ryan said smoothly, slipping his hands into his trouser pockets. "And I must say, Richard, your son was incredibly eager to sign those penalty clauses today. It made my job remarkably easy." Richard stared at my husband, his mind desperately trying to process the catastrophic reality of his situation. He looked like a man who had just discovered the parachute he was wearing was actually an anvil. "Penalty clauses." Richard repeated, his voice barely a hollow croak. "You structured the merger to fail." "I structured the merger to test your leadership," I corrected him, taking a step forward so I was standing dead center in front of the ruined executive. "If you had maintained a stable executive board, if you had properly reviewed the addendums with the legal team, and if you had not allowed your incompetent son to unilaterally fire your lead director on her wedding day, the Vanguard merger would have closed seamlessly on Monday morning. You would have walked away with a highly profitable partnership. But we both knew that was never going to happen, Richard. We knew your arrogance and Bradley's massive ego would inevitably trigger the fail-safes." Richard shook his head rapidly, a nervous sweat breaking out across his forehead. "This is entrapment. This is illegal. You orchestrated a fraudulent contract to steal my company. I will take this to the Securities and Exchange Commission. I will have you both indicted for corporate espionage." Naomi laughed. It was a bright musical sound that echoed over the silent ballroom. "You really need to hire better in-house counsel, Richard. There is absolutely nothing illegal about a private equity firm enforcing a standard key person penalty clause. Your son signed the contract voluntarily. He used his own executive credentials. He bypassed your own internal compliance blocks. You handed Vanguard Holdings the knife, placed it directly against your own throat, and begged them to push." Ryan pulled his hands out of his pockets and adjusted his tailored cuffs. The casual movement commanded the absolute attention of every financial professional in the room. The senior banking executives and hedge fund managers were watching my husband with a mixture of profound shock and deep reverence. They were witnessing a masterclass in corporate warfare. "Let us discuss the immediate future of Thorn." "Financial," Ryan said, his voice projecting with the cold, undeniable authority of a billionaire claiming his prize. "As of 5 o'clock today, your firm owes Vanguard Holdings exactly $50 million in punitive damages for breaching the transition agreement. I know your quarterly ledgers, Richard. I know you do not have $50 million in liquid capital sitting in your accounts. Your assets are tied up in long-term investments and severely over-leveraged real estate." Richard swallowed hard. His eyes darted around the room, looking at the silent faces of his investors and board members. He knew Ryan was telling the exact truth. He was financially trapped. "When a firm cannot pay a catastrophic breach of contract penalty," Ryan continued, pacing slowly across the dance floor, "the debt immediately triggers the default covenants on their existing corporate loans. By Monday morning, Thorn Financial will be entirely insolvent. The banks will freeze your operational accounts. Your creditors will demand immediate repayment. You will be completely bankrupt before lunchtime." Bradley let out a pathetic, whimpering sob from the floor. He was clutching his knees to his chest, rocking slightly back and forth. He finally understood that his desperate need to steal my glory had just annihilated his entire family fortune. "But Vanguard Holdings is incredibly generous," Ryan said, stopping right in front of Richard. "We do not want to see a historic Chicago financial institution collapse into messy public bankruptcy. So Vanguard is going to step in and assume your massive debt. We are going to buy your toxic liabilities from the banks for pennies on the dollar." You are executing a hostile takeover. Richard gasped, the horrific realization hitting him with the force of a freight train. You never wanted a merger. You wanted to acquire my firm. I wanted a return on my investment, Ryan corrected smoothly. And acquiring Thorn Financial at a severely distressed valuation is a spectacular return. When Vanguard assumes your debt on Monday morning, we will immediately convert that debt into controlling equity. We are not merging with you, Richard. We own you. I stepped up right beside my husband. The power radiating between us was absolute. I looked at the man who had exploited my labor, stolen my credit, and degraded my worth for 5 long years. The first order of business under the new Vanguard ownership structure will be a complete liquidation of the executive board, I announced, my voice ringing out clear and strong. Every single board member who enabled your toxic leadership will be forcefully retired. We are stripping the executive suite down to the studs. Richard raised a shaking hand, pointing at me. My shares. I own 40% of the voting shares. You cannot just erase my equity. I will vote against the debt conversion. I will block the acquisition. Your shares are officially worthless, Richard Naomi stated, stepping forward to deliver the final, crushing legal reality. When a firm defaults on a $50 million penalty and a private equity entity assumes the debt, the existing shareholder equity is completely wiped out in the restructuring process. Your 40% voting block does not exist anymore. You have no leverage. You have no vote. You have absolutely nothing. Richard stumbled backward. He bumped into a large, white floral arrangement, knocking a crystal vase to the floor. It shattered loudly, sending water and white roses spilling across the polished wood. He did not even look down. He stared at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated devastation. The empire he had built, the legacy he had ruthlessly protected, and the immense wealth he had hoarded were entirely gone. He had spent his entire career bullying subordinates, manipulating clients, and promoting his highly incompetent son over genuinely talented women. He thought his power was absolute. He thought he was untouchable. He had severely underestimated the quiet, brilliant woman who managed his risk assessments. He had failed to realize that while he was busy playing corporate tyrant, I was carefully designing the exact architecture of his ultimate destruction. You planned this from the very beginning, Richard whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. You introduced Vanguard Holdings to the board. You vouched for the merger. You set the entire board up to be slaughtered. I presented a highly lucrative business opportunity, I replied calmly. I gave you a choice, Richard. If you had treated me with a single ounce of basic professional respect, you and your son would be incredibly wealthy men right now. But you chose to let Bradley fire me on my wedding day. You chose to try and steal my work. You pulled the trigger. I just made sure the weapon was pointed directly at your own head. Bradley let out another loud, pathetic sob from the floor. He tried to reach out and grab his father's pant leg, desperately seeking comfort from the man whose legacy he had just incinerated. Richard looked down at his son. There was no paternal love in his eyes. There was no sympathy or forgiveness. There was only pure, unfiltered hatred. Richard violently kicked his leg away, forcing Bradley to scramble backward across the wet, polished floor to avoid being struck. "Get away from me," Richard snarled at his son, his voice dripping with venomous disgust. "You absolute failure. You ruined everything." I watched the pathetic display of a broken dynasty with absolute detachment. Richard was standing over his weeping son. His fists clenched, his face contorted into a mask of pure hatred. He was blaming Bradley for the collapse of Thorn Financial, entirely blind to the fact that his own toxic leadership and blind nepotism had laid the foundation for this catastrophe years ago. Bradley was openly sobbing on the hardwood floor, a grown man wearing a bespoke suit, crying over a shattered ego and a vanished trust fund. They were tearing each other apart right in the middle of my wedding reception, and I did not feel a single drop of pity for either of them. I turned slightly and reached toward my sweetheart table. I bypassed the ruined crystal flute holding Bradley's dead corporate phone and picked up a fresh, untouched glass of vintage champagne. The delicate crystal felt cool and perfectly balanced in my hand. I stepped back to stand shoulder to shoulder with my husband and my brilliant sister-in-law. Naomi was watching the two men with a look of clinical satisfaction, her tablet tucked neatly under her arm. Ryan rested his hand on my waist, his presence an immovable anchor of support and absolute authority. We were the new power structure in the room, and every single person in the ballroom knew it. Richard finally tore his gaze away from his disgraced son and looked back at me. The venom in his eyes had been entirely replaced by a hollow, crushing despair. He looked at the champagne glass in my hand, and then he looked at Ryan. He knew there were no more threats to make. There were no more negotiations. The firm was gone. His legacy was erased. He was just a trespasser standing in a rented ballroom surrounded by people who had already calculated his exact lack of value. I raised my glass of champagne, holding it up into the warm light of the crystal chandeliers. I locked my eyes directly onto Richard's defeated face, making sure he felt the full devastating weight of my final words to him. Like Bradley said earlier, I announced, my voice carrying clearly across the utterly silent dance floor. Consider it my wedding gift to you. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the champagne. It tasted absolutely spectacular. I did not wait for Richard to respond. I did not give him the satisfaction of another second of my time. I simply lowered my glass, turned my back on the ruined chief executive officer, and faced my husband. Ryan smiled, a genuine warm expression that completely banished the cold corporate predator from his face. Naomi turned gracefully on her heel, her emerald gown sweeping across the floor, completely dismissing the two men behind us. At that exact moment, the heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom swung open again. 4 broad-shouldered hotel security guards marched into the room, their expressions uniformly stern and professional. They had been summoned by the venue management the second Bradley had grabbed the microphone, and they had waited in the wings until the confrontation reached its natural conclusion. The head of security, a tall man with a strictly professional demeanor, walked directly past our table and approached Richard and Bradley. He did not care about their former executive titles. He did not care about their bespoke suits. He only cared that they were uninvited guests, causing a disturbance at a highly expensive private event. "Gentlemen," the head security guard stated firmly, his voice echoing in the quiet room, "you are trespassing at a private function. You need to vacate the premises immediately, or we will involve the local authorities and have you formally charged." Richard Thorne, a man who had spent his entire adult life dictating terms to everyone around him, did not argue. He did not demand to speak to a manager. He simply looked at the security guards with dead, empty eyes. He turned around and began to walk toward the exit. His shoulders slumped, dragging his feet across the carpet, like a man walking to his own execution. He did not even look back to see if his son was following him. Bradley scrambled up from the floor, his face red and stained with tears. He practically tripped over his own feet as he rushed to follow his father out the doors, closely escorted by the 3 remaining security guards. They walked out of the ballroom in total disgrace, completely stripped of their power, their wealth, and their dignity. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind them with a firm, satisfying thud. The second the doors locked, the entire atmosphere of the ballroom shifted. The suffocating, heavy tension instantly evaporated, replaced by an electric, buzzing wave of relief and pure excitement. The senior banking executives, the hedge fund managers, and the elite investors who had watched the entire hostile takeover unfold did not mourn the fall of Thorne Financial. They worshipped power, and they had just witnessed a brilliant, flawless transfer of it. Someone at the back of the room started clapping. It was a slow, solitary sound at first, but within seconds another guest joined in, then another, and another. The applause swept across the ballroom like a tidal wave. 200 high-net-worth individuals, my trusted colleagues, and my fiercely loyal friends, rose to their feet. The sound was deafening, a roaring standing ovation for the woman who had just surgically dismantled the most toxic leadership in the Chicago financial district and secured a multi-billion-dollar empire in the process. The band leader, catching the infectious, triumphant energy of the room, immediately signaled his musicians. The brass section raised their instruments, the drummer caught the beat, and the jazz band struck up a lively, spectacular, incredibly joyful tune that completely drowned out the last remnants of corporate stress. Ryan stepped closer to me, his dark eyes shining with absolute adoration and immense pride. He gently took the crystal champagne flute from my hand and placed it on the edge of the sweetheart table. He reached out and pulled me into his arms, wrapping me in a warm, secure embrace that felt like coming home. "You were absolutely magnificent," Ryan whispered, leaning down so I could hear him over the music and the cheering crowd. I smiled, wrapping my arms around his neck, feeling a profound, limitless sense of freedom wash over me. The grueling 80-hour weeks were over. The constant gaslighting was finished. I had reclaimed my life, secured my value, and taken complete control of my own destiny. We stepped out right into the center of the dance floor, surrounded by the applause of our guests and the brilliant, warm light of the chandeliers. I leaned my head against my husband's chest, listening to the steady, comforting beat of his heart. And right there in the middle of our spectacular wedding reception, Ryan and I shared our very first completely stress-free dance as billionaires.